Chapter 21 of The Girls of St. Wode's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie Manchus. The Girls of St. Wode's by L.T. Meade. Mr. Parker and Leslie went in the direction of the river. They walked slowly down the towing path. Several of the college girls were out in their different boats. Leslie began to remark about them. The merchant held up his hand to stop her. "We will discuss the beauties of nature and the beauty of those fair companions of yours later on," he remarked. "But first of all I want to talk over the very important matter which has brought me here today, Miss Leslie. I want you to confide in me. What is up, my dear? What is up?" "What is up?" cried Leslie. "I do not understand you. Oh, I know," she added, her face turning pale, "that you're hiding something dreadful from me. Mother is ill, or Llewellyn, or one of the girls. But I've heard nothing, I assure you. Oh, please tell me the truth at once." "It is hard for you to tell me," replied Mr. Parker, somewhat tartly. "Let me assure you once for all that your family are in the best of health. But, Miss Leslie, I did think that well, I will say it, I felt hurt at what occurred yesterday." "But what can you mean, you felt hurt at what occurred yesterday?" "What did occur? I assure you I'm absolutely in the dark." "Oh, no, you are not, young lady. You are putting it on, and that does not suit a man of my caliber at all. Instead of coming to me yourself, or even writing to me, instead of giving me your full confidence, and feeling sure that I, as your father's old friend, would not be too hard on you, you had not the courage to do that. You sent a stranger to me." "I cannot understand," said poor Leslie. Her heart beat fast. She felt quite certain now that some trouble was going to be revealed to her. She knew that the moment had come when she must exercise self-control. Happen what might, she must not give herself away. Another, a stranger, had approached Mr. Parker on her behalf. A queer sense of heart-sickness came over her. She seemed partly to guess already what was coming. Making a violent effort not to show the alarm which was paling her cheeks and almost causing her heart to stop beating, she said quickly, "Please speak." Mr. Parker had observed her agitation, and now he whispered to himself, "She has done it. I am mistaken in her. I thought she was like my Jenny. She had the same voice, and something the same ways, and very much the same expression, but I am mistaken. There never could have been two Jennies in this wicked old world. I was mistaken. The child was like her in the external features only." "Please speak," repeated Leslie. "I am going to speak," said the merchant. "I am disappointed. No, I am not going to be angry. I suppose all girls, all but one, and her I won't mention in this discussion, are alike all the world over. If they suddenly want a little money, and remember that their father's old friend can be befooled, being an old man himself, and tender-hearted, they yield to temptation. You are like the rest, Miss Leslie, just like the rest. Your mother shall never know, nor that brave brother of yours. I won't say another word when I have had my say out to-day, but, my dear, let me ask you just once, why did you do it?" "Oh, you are driving me mad," said poor Leslie. "You are talking about something I did, but I don't know yet what I did. Do speak." "You don't know about that £60? Come now, that's putting it on too fine. You went into debt for £60, and were afraid, and sent that other girl, Annie Colchester, whose shoes you are not fit to black, for the money. I gave it to her, of course, for your letter was so pitiable, but I did not tell her that I was coming down the next day to inquire into this matter myself." There was a seat close by. It faced the river. Leslie sat down on it, just as if somebody had shot her. She did not speak for some time. Had she done so, she must have burst out with the truth. In her immense effort for self-control, for repression of her feelings, she even thought that she was going to faint. "You ran in debt, child. The temptations here were too much for you. You ran in debt for fal lals and gewgaws, and all the other sort of things which please pretty girls. You thought, of course, the old man would pay up. Well, the old man has paid up. I am sorry. You might have asked me for the money in the first place and not gone in debt for it, but that is the way with modern girls. We will say no more about it. I see you did not want to pain me." Mr. Parker patted her on the arm. Leslie shrank away from him. "Don't," she said. "I cannot bear you to touch me just now." "You cannot bear me to touch you? Well, that's nice hearing, when I'm spending my money on you, and thinking such a lot of you, and remembering the straight, honourable sort of man your father was." "But do you, knowing my father as you did, feeling for him as you still do you really believe this of me?" said Leslie.
"Believe it of you? How can I help it, child? But if there is any way any way to lessen the kind of shock I got yesterday, I will bless you, Leslie Gilroy, till the longest day I live."
Leslie again felt as if she had got a dash of cold water. She could clear herself, but at what a cost! "Tell me exactly what occurred before I say anything more," she said in a low, tremulous voice.
"Oh, that's all easy enough," said Mr. Parker. "It was Annie Colchester who came to me. I have known her brother for a year or two. Rupert is about as bad a lot as I have ever met. The girl is different, clever, with a lot of enthusiasm and blind worship for that good-for-nothing brother of hers. I helped Rupert, took him into my own office, but afterwards I had to give him the sack. I could not keep that sort about me, you understand."
"Please go on," said Leslie.
"Well, I dismissed him about a month ago for improper conduct. I expect that chap will go to the dogs as fast as he can. I am the last man, Leslie, to uphold young rascals of that sort. He is a scoundrel, and the least said about him the better. The girl is different. I had letters from her now and then, and she always spoke of you with great affection. She never mentioned you by name, and I never guessed until yesterday, when she called to see me, that you were the girl, her room-fellow, she said, whom she liked better than anybody else at St. Wode's, that you were the same girl whom I cared for more than aught else in the world."
"Oh, you don't," said Leslie. There was a break in her voice.
"I do, child. You always seemed to me to be Jenny come back again. But there, once for all, I will not drag Jenny into this. Annie Colchester called at my office yesterday. She brought me a note from you. By the way, here it is."
"Don't show it to me," said Leslie suddenly.
"Don't show you your own letter? Why not?"
"Because—oh, don't ask me." She felt cold and sick. If Mr. Parker really showed her that letter, written by Annie, but signed in her name, she knew that she could not trust herself. She knew that she must say something which would betray her miserable friend. The one rope she had to cling to was a blind sense of honor. She would give Annie a chance. She would not betray her. She would get Annie herself to make her own confession. "What train must you go back by?" she said suddenly.
"You look quite ill, child. I see you cannot put the thing straight, as I had hoped just for a moment. But after I have asked you one or two questions, we will never allude to the matter again. Was it an ordinary debt you wanted the money for?"
Leslie bent her head in apparent acquiescence.
"Then that is a relief. I did think that you were above all the petty wants and caprices of your sex. But if you do want to look pretty and charming, why, my dear, I have more money than I know what to do with. Here." He fumbled in his pocket. "Would you like another £20? For I have got some bank-notes. I could let you have 3 or 4. You are pretty enough to look charming in the simplest dress, but if you think otherwise, why—"
"Oh, don't, Mr. Parker," cried Leslie. "I cannot touch your money. Put it away, please." She brushed it from her. The strain was becoming intolerable. "Did you say," she continued, "that Annie took you that note herself?"
"Yes, my dear. You told me in it that you particularly wished to get the money in notes and gold. So I sent notes and gold. Now, Leslie, don't be tempted in that way again. If you want money, come to me straight. Say to me, 'Mr. Parker, for the sake of my father, let me have £5, or 10, or 15, or whatever supply you want.' Don't ask me in Jenny's name, for Jenny would not have done that sort of thing. But for Gilroy's sake, I'll never refuse you, child. Don't go into debt for it, that's all."
"I never will," said poor Leslie. "Oh, I cannot explain things now, and I know you must think dreadfully of me."
"I see that you are concealing something," said Parker, knitting his brows and giving her another fixed look. "Tell me the whole truth, little girl."
"I can't. Not at present."
Mr. Parker's voice changed again. He looked hard at Leslie, then he looked away. He pursed his lips and uttered a long whistle. "If you cannot tell me, well, there's no more to be said," he remarked. "I am cut up a bit, that's all. But understand this, Leslie, I'll have no more fooling. There is a limit even to my endurance, and when roused I can be hard and very just. I will never tell your mother. I wouldn't vex her, nor give her another care for all the money I possess. You did wrong in spending that money before you got it. You did very wrong to go into debt. If you go into debt again, why, there I won't help you. But if you ask me for money and say you want it, and give me a good reason, even if it is to buy a smart frock or pretty hat, you shall have it, child. And there's my last word. Good-bye, my dear. Don't fret too much. Whatever you may have done wrong, you stand in Jenny's place to me now. Cheer up. Cheer up." But Leslie could not utter a word. She did not even raise her head. She was only conscious that Mr. Parker had pulled out his watch, uttered a hasty exclamation, looked left and right, and then going up to her, stooped and kissed her lightly on her forehead. "For your father's sake, and for the sake of old times," he said. She heard his retreating footsteps as he went along the towing path to Wingfield. For nearly an hour Leslie Gilroy sat on that seat alone. None of her companions came by. She was glad of this, if she could be said to be glad of anything at that moment. She felt stunned. All her life up to the present had been bright. She found herself all of a sudden, through no fault of her own, in the position of one who is degraded, dishonored. She, who had always been upright, respectable, and respected. With her and open sin there was nothing whatever in common. To sin gravely, to commit a really great sin, was impossible to a nature like Leslie's. Direct temptation would shrink away from one so pure, so innocent, so generous, so loving, and now she was stained, just as if she had really committed the sin which she loathed. How could she live under this terrible imputation? How could she take the sin of another and bear it bravely on her young shoulders? The man to whom she was indebted for so much believed her guilty. How could she stand it? Was it right for her to stand it? Leslie considered this with bent head and knitted brows. Suppose she wrote to Mr. Parker and told him the truth, what would happen then? She could guess, and the thought of what would happen caused her to tremble. He liked her, he was kind to her for her dead father's sake, and because he imagined that she bore a likeness to the child he had lost. But he had spoken with a certain harshness of the Colchesters. He would certainly not stand the knowledge that he had been befooled by a girl twice as clever as himself. He would come down to Wingfield. He would see Annie. He would speak to the authorities about her. She would be rusticated, sent down, expelled. Her career in life would be practically ruined. No, Leslie felt she could not betray her. "Not yet, anyhow," she said to herself. "If she will confess, I think Mr. Parker will forgive her. But I cannot be the one to ruin her whole life." Leslie struggled hard to regain her ordinary calmness, but try as she would, she could not get it back. Annie had hurt her too deeply. To take a letter purporting to be written in her hand to Mr. Parker, to borrow money in her name, to get Mr. Parker to think so badly of her. Oh, the sin was too dark. It cut too sore. It lay too deep. Leslie shivered as she returned slowly to the house. Eileen Chetwynd met her in the quadrangle and ran up eagerly. "We were looking for you, Leslie," she cried. "We wanted you to come on the water with us this lovely afternoon. Have you a headache? You don't look well." "Perhaps I have a headache, but I don't quite know," replied Leslie. "You don't quite know? You look queer. I will go upstairs and lie down." Leslie ran past Eileen, who stared after her in some wonder. When Leslie entered her room, Annie, still buried in her novel, was crouched up on the window-sill.
Her books, papers, and problems were pushed aside. Her hair was rumpled, her cheeks slightly flushed. Nevertheless, there was an expression of rest about her face that Leslie had never before seen there. She turned away from her, feeling that she could scarcely bear to inhabit the same room. For the first time in her gentle life, hatred of another was visiting her. Her religious principles did not come to her aid in this crisis. She felt a sense of being crushed. She felt sure that because of this thing she must go halt and maimed for the remainder of her days. Annie looked up as she came in. "Had a good time?" she asked in a light, careless sort of voice. "I was down by the river," replied Leslie coldly. "Has your visitor gone?" asked Annie, not noticing the tone. "Yes. He returned to London by the 5:30. Leslie wondered that Annie did not take alarm when she heard that her visitor had come from London, but the possibility of Mr. Parker's appearing at Wingfield had evidently never entered her brain. She turned another page of her novel and read on contentedly. "How good it is to have a whole afternoon's real rest," she said, "and this book is splendid. By the way, have you read it? The Caxtons, by Bulwer Lytton." "Yes, I have read it," replied Leslie in a low tone. "Don't you want to make any tea this afternoon?" said Annie. "I'm so thirsty." "I don't care about tea tonight," replied Leslie. "We shall be going down to dinner in less than an hour." Annie stifled a sigh, and once more resumed her book. Leslie went and sat with her back to her. She took up a book, but she could not read. As a rule, it was Leslie's task and privilege to get tea for them both. Annie missed her companion's gentle attentions. After a minute or two, she tumbled from her seat on the window-sill, and began in a perfunctory manner to get ready for dinner. Leslie also rose, shook out her dress, put on a fresh tie and collar, and smoothed her hair. "You are not making much of a toilet this evening," said Annie. "Oh, I shall do very well," replied Leslie. "Do? I should think you will," said Annie, in a tone of almost affection. "If I had as pretty a face as yours, I should not much mind how I dressed. Oh, yes, perhaps I should. Perhaps I should give up my whole life to my beautiful face, and spend all my time devising means to make it still more attractive." "Don't!" said Leslie in a sharp voice. The thought that Mr. Parker also supposed that she was vain enough and despicable enough to go into debt for fine clothes returned to her memory with Annie's words. "You look sweet," said Annie. "Come along, take my arm. I am in a mighty good humour, I can tell you, and as hungry as a hawk. I miss the tea which you, kind little room-fellow, have generally got for me." "Go on, don't wait for me," said Leslie. "I have forgotten a handkerchief." She ran back just when they reached the door. Annie, in some wonder, went downstairs alone. Leslie waited until she had gone. "Oh, God, help me to bear it," she said, raising a piteous cry to the one who alone could help her. Then, feeling a little better, she went downstairs and took her place at table. When dinner was over, one or two girls came up to invite both Annie and Leslie to join them at a cocoa party. Leslie looked at Annie with a sort of suppressed eagerness. She would be going out presently, thought the girl. She would be going to meet that bad fellow, to give him the money which has ruined my life. I shall watch her. I hate being with her, and yet I cannot keep away from her. She waited for Annie to speak again. "Do you want to go?" she said. "No, I cannot go this evening," said Annie, "but it will be all right for you, Leslie. You will go, will you not?" "I shall stay with you," said Leslie in a dogged sort of voice. The girls who had invited them looked somewhat surprised and disappointed. They said nothing more, however, and Leslie and Annie went upstairs once more to their own room. Annie went and stood by the open window. "What can be the matter with you?" she said, turning to her companion. "You do look very queer. You have not been a bit like yourself for the last hour or two." Leslie made no reply. Annie glanced at her again. "It is so hot tonight," she said. "I'm going out for a stroll. I may not be in until 10:30, or even later." "Why, Leslie Gilroy, you are quite glaring at me. Your eyes have got the queerest expression." "Never mind about my eyes," replied Leslie. "I have something to say." Her quiet was over. She knew that the time for action had come. "Annie Colchester," she said, "I know where you're going. You have got a chance, one chance. Will you take it?" "You know where I'm going, and I have got a chance. What do you mean? How very queer you look." "I will tell you in a few words exactly what I mean. I know everything. There is time yet. Annie, Annie, you cannot really mean to ruin me. I have always been kind to you. That is, I have tried to be kind. You cannot mean quite to ruin me, Annie." "To ruin you? To ruin you, Leslie? No, I don't mean to ruin you." It was now Annie's turn to look pale. Her eyes, startled and alarmed, glanced from Leslie to the ground. "At any rate, don't keep me now," she said, a shiver passing through her frame. "When I come back I will talk with you as long as you like, but I am in a great hurry. We can talk over what you mean. I am sure I cannot imagine what it can be, when I come back." "We must talk now," cried Leslie. "It will be too late when you come back. Annie, I have something to confess to you. God knows you have something terrible to confess to me, but my confession comes first. I followed you the night before last. After the meeting at East Hall, I came back to our room and found you absent. I was restless and miserable about you, and I went out to look for you. I was standing near the boat-house when you landed with— "You saw us!" cried Annie. "You are a sneak, a spy. You saw us, and you—" "Yes, I saw you. I stood in the shadow, and I heard what you said. The man who was with you—" "Don't dare say a word against him," cried Annie. "Yes, I will. He is a rascal, a scoundrel." "Oh, he is my brother!" cried Annie. "The only one I love in all the world, and you dare not abuse him. What right have you?" "I have every right, Annie. I know the truth. He wanted money. I heard him say so. He spoke cruelly of you, and you promised to help him. You were in great trouble, and I pitied you from my soul. I did not know. I could not guess that you would make use of me, the crudest, most terrible use. You forged a letter in my name, and you took it to my friend, Mr. Parker." "How can you know?" said Annie. Her voice had sunk to the lowest whisper. Leslie had to strain her ears to catch the words. "I know in the best possible way, from the best authority," replied Leslie. "Mr. Parker came to see me today, and he told me everything." "And you betrayed me?" Annie flung herself suddenly on her knees. She covered her face with her shaking hands. "Oh, and I had thought myself safe," she continued. "I have lived through such awful agony. Misery beyond words was mine, and just when I thought myself safe. Oh, I was resting today. I was so tired, but all my security was false, and I am done for, ruined. Why was I ever born?" She uttered a piercing cry and fell forward on her face and hands. "Get up, Annie. Don't kneel like that. I did not betray you." "You did not betray me? Do you mean what you are saying?" Annie started up now, came close to Leslie, and tried to take her hand. "Mr. Parker came here today and told you what I did, and you did not tell him the truth? Oh, you angel, you darling! All my life, as long as I live, I will live for you and devote myself to you. Oh, you darling, you brave darling!" "Don't," said Leslie. "You would not speak those words to me if you knew what I felt in my heart. Do you think I love you now? No, I am scarcely sorry for you. I simply feel that I cannot betray you." "Then all is well," said Annie. "I don't mind in the least at the present moment whether you hate me or not. I declare now, and I shall always maintain it, that you are the noblest girl in the world." "But, Annie, do you quite understand? You cannot mean to go on with this. Now that you know what it is to me, you must make restitution. You cannot allow Mr. Parker to go on thinking day after day, month after month, and year after year that I was really guilty of the terrible sin and meanness of going into debt for £60, then sending you to him to ask him to pay my debt. You cannot mean this, Annie." "Yes, I do mean it, and so would you if you had a brother like Rupert, and you felt that all his future depended on your helping him. What are you compared to Rupert? He is the only one in the world I passionately love. Oh, there, the clock has struck 10, and he will be waiting for me. If he does not get that £60 tonight, he will be desperate. The police are after him. I know. He will be locked up. Oh, what is your grief compared to his misery? Leslie, I am going out. You did not betray me today, and you won't betray me now. Let me go. Let me go." "Not without me," said Leslie, with sudden firmness. "If you go, I shall go, but if you refuse, I will speak to—" "Oh, don't, don't! Come if you wish, anything, so that we can get to him at once. He will be out in prison, sent to penal servitude, and I shall go mad, raving mad. Come, be quick, be quick!" Annie dragged Leslie by her arm, not allowing her time to utter another word. The girls flew downstairs together, and a moment later were out, with the stars looking down at them, and the moon shining on the beautiful river. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of The Girls of St. Wode's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Girls of St. Wode's by L.T. Meade. The Promise. Annie dragged her companion in the direction of the boat-house. A man was standing in the deepest shadow. When the girls came up, he took a step forward. Then, seeing two, he started back. "It is all right, Rupert," cried Annie. I've got the money." Leslie, who was watching him attentively, saw him change color. He had a bronzed cheek and a keen dark eye. The bronze left his cheek now, and his eyes flashed fire. "Is it true?" he said. Annie held out both her hands to him. He clasped them so tight that it was with difficulty she could repress a cry. But as he did so, he looked beyond her at Leslie. There was alarm and incredulity in his glance. "It is all right. I brought her here, or, rather, she would come. It is through her I got it. All my life I must thank her for what she has done for you." "This is more than I can bear," cried Leslie. "I have come here, it is true, Mr. Colchester, but not for the purpose you think. I have come here to tell you what I think of you. I do not know what trouble you have got into, nor do I wish to know. But I do know what your sister has done. I blame her, yes, I blame her most bitterly, but I blame you more." "Don't tell, don't tell!" cried Annie. She came up to Leslie and tried to put her hand across her mouth. "I will tell him, but no one else," said Leslie. "He must know. He drove you to it, and he must know. Listen," she added. She came up close to Rupert Colchester and stared him full in the face. "Your sister wrote a letter in my name to my best friend. She wrote it to the man who is kinder to me than anyone else in the world. She signed the letter with my signature, and he thought that it came from me. Having written the letter, she made an excuse to go to London yesterday, and took it to him. It contained a request to give me, because I had gone into debt, £60. The money was to be given in notes and gold. She brought the money back, and now she, not I, is giving it to you." "Indeed?" said the man. He started back. He looked from Annie to Leslie. "I didn't know you were clever enough for that," he said. "It seems to run in our blood, I mean the capacity for thieving. I did not know you could do it. You are clever enough, Annie, and you have cheek enough. But to do that, to commit a forgery, and to drag another girl in—" "It was done for you, and you, of all people, ought not to blame her," said Leslie. "You had cheek?" repeated Colchester. He laid his hand lightly on his sister's shoulder. "I thank you from my heart, of course. And you too, Miss I don't know your name." "You had better not know it. I don't want you to. Yes, she did it, and Mr. Parker thinks that I am guilty. Do you quite realize, both of you, what Annie Colchester has done?" "I realize it fast enough," said Colchester. "But you are a merciful girl. I see it in your eyes. Nevertheless, I will state the position quite plainly. Your sister, by writing such a letter, committed forgery." Annie uttered a deep groan and covered her face. After a moment she raised her eyes and glanced at Rupert. He was not looking at her. He was staring at Leslie. "Try and keep quiet, Annie, and allow me to speak," continued Leslie. "I do not intend to betray her. But I want you to know, Mr. Colchester, what it has cost me. It has nearly driven me mad. Think what it must mean to me. Mr. Parker imagines that I am the sort of girl who will go into debt, and then come to him to clear me. Do you know that because of this he came to Wingfield to-day? He sought me out. He spoke to me. He was in the deepest distress." "And you confided in him?" said Rupert Colchester. "Few girls would be noble enough." "Oh, you do her injustice," interrupted Annie. "She has not told. She has not betrayed us. Is it not brave of her?" "I have not told," said Leslie. "But I have had an awful struggle. If I told what Annie has really done, it might get her into such fearful trouble that she would be ruined. She would have to leave St. Wode's. Her career would be practically over. Even if the law did not punish her, she would never do any good in this country again. I have saved her from that, but it was a great effort. I have come here to-night, Mr. Colchester, to tell you that you are the one most to blame. I am going to keep this thing to myself, but only on one condition. This is the most bitter moment of my life. This thing that Annie has done on account of you has turned both my present and my future into gall and bitterness. I was the happiest of girls yesterday. Now I am the most miserable. My best friend thinks badly of me, and I can never set myself right with him. But I promise here willingly, before God, that I will not tell what Annie has done if you, on your part, will make me a promise." "What is it?" said Colchester. "'Pon my word, you're a brave sort of girl, and I don't mind, that is, short of ruining myself." "It will not ruin you. It will save you. I want you to promise me to leave Annie alone in the future." Annie uttered a sharp cry. "But I don't wish to be left alone," she said. "I cannot live without Rupert." "That you will leave Annie alone in the future," continued Leslie. "That you will never again take money from her. That £60 is my present to you. I exonerate Annie from all blame in that matter. She shall never get into trouble on my account if you, on your part, will keep your word." "You are plucky," said Colchester. He was impressed by Leslie's manner and by her remarkable beauty. The moon was shining full upon her face, which looked clear and pale and unearthly. "You are a very plucky girl," he repeated, "and Annie is in luck to have made you a friend. Yes, I am all right now. This little girl, or rather, you, Miss—" He paused, but Leslie did not supply the name. "Have made it all right for me. Very well. I promise not to tell what Annie has done if you make me a promise not to blackmail her again." "Blackmail? That is an ugly word," said Colchester. "After all, she is my sister." "The more shame on you, to get your sister into trouble. I have a brother. Do you think he—but there, I cannot speak of him in the same breath with you. If you attempt to blackmail Annie any more, I will tell Mr. Parker all about this matter. I will consider that the promise I have made today is no longer binding. Now it rests with yourself. Bid your sister good-bye, and go." "Oh, I cannot part with you, Rupert," cried Annie. She burst into a bitter flood of tears, flung her arms round her brother's neck, and laid her head on his shoulder. "There is nothing I would not do for you," she sobbed. Leslie moved away to a little distance. She had spoken with emphasis and spirit, but never in the whole course of her life had she felt so cold, so bitter. Although she had promised before God not to betray her miserable companion, yet she knew no sense of happiness. It seemed to her that she was setting the seal to her degradation. Never again could she be happy. Always now there would be one person who would think of her as a girl capable of any meanness, any smallness, any deceit. The mere knowledge that someone would so regard her troubled her so much that she wondered if, in the future, she could lead an upright life. And why was she doing it? For Annie did not appreciate her sacrifice, except in as far as it saved Rupert, and as to Rupert himself, it needed only to look into his face to see how weak and worthless he was. Wrapped in the misery of these thoughts, Leslie did not notice Annie until she came back and touched her on the arm. "He cannot praise you enough. You do not know what he has been saying of you. He wants to bid you good-bye now. He is going to Australia. He has made up his mind. I shall never see him more." There was a note of such utter misery in Annie's voice that Leslie, wretched as she was, started up and shook herself. "Let him go," she said. "I do not want to speak to him again." "But I so earnestly wish you would. He is terribly touched by what you have done. This may be the turning point. Do come and shake hands with him." "I cannot." "You cannot? Leslie, do you think him as bad as all that?" "He is very bad, Annie, and he is making you bad. And, oh, indirectly he is making me bad too. I cannot go. I can never touch his hand." "You are too hard," said Annie. "I could have loved you for what you have done, but when you speak against him, I cannot bear you." "Feel just as you please about me," said Leslie, "but I cannot bid your brother good-bye, nor shake hands with him. Come back to me when he has gone, and be quick. We ought to be in the house now. There is no use in our getting into fresh trouble." Annie turned slowly away. In about 10 minutes she came back to Leslie. "He has gone," she said. "He will take his passage for Australia tomorrow. I shall never see him any more." Her tone was cold, calm, and low. "Then let us return to the house," said Leslie. They went slowly across the quadrangle, entered by the side door, and went up to their room. "I wish I was not your room fellow, Annie," said Leslie. "I never knew I could feel so bitter towards anyone." "You will get over it, dear. And after all, as Rupert says— Oh, please don't mention his name." Annie looked at her, a frown coming between her brows. "I cannot understand you," she said, after a pause. "You are so noble, and yet you are so hard. Are good, very good people often like you?" "I am not good. I don't think I shall ever be good again," said poor Leslie. She sat down on the nearest seat and covered her face with her trembling hands. Annie switched on the electric light. "At least there need be no more study," she said, after a pause. Leslie did not take the slightest notice. Annie sat down on a sofa, took up the novel she had been reading that afternoon, and turned a page or two listlessly. Presently she flung it down and uttered a heart-rending sigh. That sigh reached Leslie. She looked up and tried to speak in a cheerful tone. "Are you not going to get all your books? You know, you have so much to do before the honour examination." "I do not mean to study any more." "Did not you hear me say so?" "But why? I cannot understand." "The motive for study has gone. I shall take my pass exam, and let that suffice. I shall leave Wingfield at the end of term." "But why should you give up everything?" "Why?" said Annie. "Why?" She went over and stood by the window. The night wind came in and lifted the dress of her hair and played with it. Leslie, seated on her own sofa at the farther end of the room, seemed always, in her moments of bitterest grief in the future, to see that tress of hair tossed up and down by the wind. The electric light in the room played on it, and brought out some of its red fire. Annie's face was ghastly pale, but her eyes were large and too brilliant for health. "Why should you give up everything?" repeated Leslie, after another pause. "Why? Can't you understand? Did you ever have a watch with a broken spring?" "I think so, yes." "It was useless, was it not?" "Of course, until it was mended." "Well, I'm like that watch. The spring that guided my life is broken, and, unlike the watch, it can never be mended." "You forget that there is such a thing as a watchmaker, even for the human watch," said Leslie, her tone softening. "Granted, but I shall not put myself into his hands. Good night. I am dead tired. I feel numb all over. I'm going to bed. I want beyond everything else on earth to sleep." She threw herself down on her bed without an attempt at undressing. Leslie started up to remonstrate. If Annie lay like that she would have a terrible cold in the morning. She advanced a step or two across the room, and then paused. "After all, it does not matter," she said to herself. "I should not have got into this awful scrape if I had not been good to her. I will leave her alone now. I have ruined myself absolutely and forever, but I cannot be friends with her." "Rupert has gone, Rupert has gone," moaned Annie, "and my sun has set." Leslie heard the words, but even they did not soften her. "What has come to me?" she thought. "Has this trouble turned me into a stone?" End of The Promise. Recording by Julie Niedermeyer.
Chapter 23 of The Girls of St. Wode's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Girls of St. Wode's by L.T. Meade. Chapter 23 The Picnic. The Gilroy children were all in the wildest state of excitement. It was a lovely day in July, and they were off for a picnic on the river. Leslie was standing by the center table in the dining room, busily packing a basket. Kitty was buttering bread and making sandwiches. Mabel was cutting cake into thick slices. Hester was darning a rent in the back of her dress, and Llewellyn was here, there, and everywhere. "We must start soon," he said. "When will the baskets be ready? I wonder Mother has not come in." "Is not she in?" asked Leslie, standing up to her full height and pressing her hand to her forehead. "Have you got one of your headaches back again, Leslie?" asked Llewellyn. "Oh, just a little, very little, but the air will do me good. It will be lovely to-day on the river." "Yes, splendid," said Llewellyn. "We will have tea at Twickenham, and go home in the cool of the evening. You cannot think how nice old Forrest has been about this. He gave me a holiday at once when I asked him this morning. He said that he only wished he kept a provision shop instead of a drapery shop, so that he might send us pies and things for our picnic." "But even though he does keep a linen draper's shop," said Hester, "he could still help us. I, for instance, should not at all object to materials for a new gown. This old serge is so thick and hot." "But if you put on a white shirt, dear, you will look as neat and nice as possible," said Leslie, "and won't be at all too warm." "Oh, I can't be bothered," said Hester, shrugging her shoulders. "I forgot to send my shirts to the wash on Monday, and I have not one fit to be seen." "Then it serves you right if you are hot and uncomfortable," said Kitty. Kitty herself was always the pink of neatness. Hester was evidently the troublesome one of the family. Leslie went on packing her basket. She wedged in the hard-boiled eggs, raised pies, roast chickens, sandwiches, and the sweets. At last the big basket was quite full. "Doesn't it look tempting?" said Mabel, smacking her lips. "How frightfully hungry I'll be! Oh, don't forget, whatever happens, the other basket with the ginger beer and lemonade. I only trust we have got enough." "And the cold tea for Mother," said Llewellyn. "Be sure you put that in." The boys and girls chatted eagerly one to the other. "I say," cried Kitty, "isn't it nice to have old Leslie back again? We'll hate it when you have to return to your grand college in the autumn, Leslie, but I wish," she added, "you would talk more about it. I thought you'd have no end of rattling good stories to tell us, but you are as mum and quiet as if you had not had a good time at all, whereas of course you have had the best time a girl could have. I suppose it is the weight of all the learning that bothers you. And what about those Chetwynds? You wrote to mother about them, and about that extraordinary girl, Belle Acheson. But since you have come back, you have hardly said a word about any of your fellow students." "I am sorry," said Leslie. "I will try to tell you something amusing to-day, Kitty. I don't want to make myself mum and disagreeable." "Oh, you are never that, you dear old darling. Only we were hoping for so much, weren't we, Hetty?" "Yes," said Hester, who was still darning the rent in her dress. "I do wish this cotton wouldn't break so." "Give it to me," said Leslie. "I'll have it darned in a trice. Ah, there's mother's step at last. Dear old mummy, I hope she's not too tired." "There is some one coming back with her," said Kitty. "Don't you hear 2 footsteps? Who can it possibly be?" The next moment the room door was opened, and Mrs. Gilroy, accompanied by Mr. Parker, came in. Leslie had not seen Mr. Parker since her interview with him at Wingfield. She now felt herself turning pale. Her pallor was suddenly succeeded by a quick flush of colour. She hoped no one had noticed her agitation, but, raising her eyes, she met those of Llewellyn. His wore a perturbed expression. Mr. Parker, after greeting the other children, came up to her and offered his hand. "Glad to see you back again, Miss Leslie," he said. There was an indescribable, restrained note in his voice. "Well, children, what do you say to my joining you to-day?" He turned and faced Kitty and Hester. "Your mother was good enough to invite me, and I am as up to a bit of frolic as if I were as young as you. Where is little Dan? He must be my special charge to-day." "Kitty, give me those sandwiches. I can finish packing them," said Leslie in a low voice which she hardly recognized as her own. After Mr. Parker's one hand clasp, which was firm and cordial enough, he had turned his back on her. He still did so, and kept on talking to Llewellyn and the younger children. Mrs. Gilroy sat down on the sofa. "It is very hot," she said. "And you are very tired," said Mr. Parker. "Now listen. I am going to have my own way, and nobody shall interfere. What is the good of money if you cannot spend it now and then? You want to go to Richmond?" turning to Mrs. Gilroy. "Go to Richmond you shall, but you are not going by train. No, we will have a carriage, and I will drive you down. A carriage will hold you, and myself, and a couple of the children. Not another word, my dear friend. What is the good of money if you cannot have a treat?" "But you do far too much for us, Mr. Parker," replied Mrs. Gilroy. "Far too much!" he answered. "Tut, tut! Not a bit of it. I'm a lonely man, madam. My one interest in life is you and your family." Here he glanced at Leslie, but the next moment looked away. There was disapproval in his face. Leslie started up impulsively. All the provisions were packed. "Yes, mother," she cried, "do let Mr. Parker drive you. It will do you no end of good." "All right, darling. I have not the least objection if you will come with us. I need not ask you, Mr. Parker, if you object to Leslie being one of the party in the carriage." "Dan shall sit on my knee," said Mr. Parker, "and 2 of the children shall be crowded in, just as Miss Leslie likes, of course." But Leslie had left the room. She called Llewellyn to follow her. He hurried out. "What is the matter with you, Leslie?" he said. "My head is very bad. I cannot go to the picnic." "Leslie, you will upset us all, and as to mother—" "Listen, Lou. I cannot give you any reason, but neither can I go, and I want you to help me." "But I fail to understand. You were full of going a moment ago." "I know, but with a headache like mine there is nothing for it but rest and quiet. Do help me, please. I am most anxious that mother should have this one delightful, happy day. Let Kitty and Mabel go in the carriage, and Dan too, if there is room. And will you take Hester by train? Let mother think that I am coming with you. Then, when you meet by the river, you must tell her that I had a bad headache, and was obliged to stay at home. I cannot go, Lou. There is no use in coaxing me, and I do not wish mother to know until she gets to Richmond." "Well, of course I'll manage it, if it must be managed," said Llewellyn, "but I cannot imagine what is up. I am certain it is more than a mere headache. But of course, Leslie, I have no intention of forcing your confidence." "Don't, like a darling," said Leslie. She touched him on the arm, and looked into his face. "Then you are in trouble, dear old girl?" Tears rose to her eyes. "Yes, but you cannot help me to bear it. It is something which I must not tell to anyone. I must just bear my burden alone. Do not ask me any more." "I won't, and I'll manage things for you. Run upstairs now and keep quiet. I'll tell mother when we get to Richmond that you are a bit seedy, but that a few hours of rest will put you all right." He hurried off, and a few moments later Leslie from her window saw the carriage party under way. Soon afterwards Llewellyn and Hester started off for the railway station. Leslie found herself alone. She sat down by her window and tried to face the position. It had not been the first time she had made a gallant effort to do so. "But what am I to do?" she said now to herself. But the answer came quickly. "Live it down," was the reply of her heart. "Be true to your sense of honour. Save your friend if you can. Bear the terrible and cruel position in which you are placed. Trust to God putting things right." "But the dreadful part of it is," thought poor Leslie, "that he is making me so hard. I almost hate Annie Colchester. I did not know it was in me to feel so bad about anything. There is one thing certain. I shall never be able to endure Mr. Parker's eyes. I shall have to leave the room or the house when he comes to see us. There, I must not sit still any longer. Poor darling Loo! He little knows what I am really suffering." Early in the afternoon there came a ring at the front door, and who should be standing on the threshold but the well-known figure of Belle Aitchison. Leslie ran to let her in. "How lucky that I was in!" she said. "Please come into the dining-room, Belle." "So this is your domicile," said Belle. She raised her eyes and looked up at the windows, then, glancing round the walls, finally settled them on the much-worn carpet at her feet. "Neat, but not gaudy," she said. "Not much to complain of when all is said and done. How do you do?" She held out her hand to her friend. Leslie grasped it. "I'm delighted to see you," said Leslie. "I am all alone, for mother and the children are on the river." "And you, you dear, faithful soul, have stayed at home to go on with your literary studies?" exclaimed Belle, her eyes gleaming. "Not a bit of it, Belle. You must not think me better than I deserve. I stayed at home to mope." "To mope? Surely you are not regretting? Having put your hand to the plough, you are not looking back? Leslie, I could never have thought it of you." "I am not looking back, Belle. I am still as fond as ever of my studies. But at the present moment I am not thinking of literature, nor of college life at all. Sit down. How hot you look! The day is such a sultry one." "Hot," said Belle, "is it? Perhaps I am hot. I don't know. Does heat matter? That is the question." She flung off her hat, and let it tumble on the floor. Her brow was wet with perspiration. "No physical discomfort seemed to matter as far as you are concerned," said Leslie with a smile. "I do not feel physical suffering," said Belle. "That is the truth. My mind is wrapped in meditation and thoughts of the future. I long for this tiresome holiday to be at an end. I have one comfort, however. My money is continuing to heap up. When I finish my collegiate career I shall have quite enough to open my hostel. I shall call it a hostel for the lovers of pure literature. I am sure it will do well. It will supply a long-felt need." But Leslie was not in the humour to talk about the hostel just then. "I have a great deal to worry me just now," continued Belle. "Mother has so little sympathy. I have no consolation but one or two books. The best of friends. By the way, Leslie, you don't look too bright yourself. Your brow has quite a haggard look. I am certain, although you will not acknowledge it, that you are missing St. Wode's." "In many ways I am, dear." "Oh, this is delicious," said Belle. She hopped up from her seat, and drew a chair close to Leslie. "Does your mother object to your studies?" she said. "Does she—" "No, Belle, you don't understand my mother. I only wish you could meet her. My trouble has nothing to do with my studies. I have a care that I cannot confide to anyone." "Pray don't. At least never confide in me. It is the last thing I wish to be, the recipient of another person's secrets. I either forget what I am told, or I blurt it out to the next person I come across. You had better let your worry go. That's my advice." "Let it go? I wish I could." "You can if you will do what I ask. Absorb yourself in work. Cease to fret about mere externals. What do they matter? Heat, cold, worry, pain even, nothing matters, if one can but grasp the riches of the past." "What about the riches of the future, Belle? You are so fond of looking back, do you ever look forward?" "Forward," said Belle. "Yes, I sometimes do. I look forward to the time when frivols will be exterminated for ever, when the drones of the ordinary course of things must die out. Leslie, dear, would you feel inclined to hear me recite some verses of my own this morning? I have been in the poetic mood for the last few days, and last night the poet's frenzy really seized me. My lines begin with 'Delve, delve, deeply delve.'" "I don't think I quite follow," said Leslie. "Quite follow. But it is so simple. The metaphor refers to a miner, the gold is beneath. He delves, he obtains, his joy is unutterable." "But I am not in the humour for poetry to day. The fact is, I am not in the humour to be anything but disobliging." "Now that I do not believe. But I will keep my verses until they are quite finished, each stanza correct, the swing, the metre perfect. By the way, have you seen the Chetwynds since they came down?" "No." "I hear that Eileen has taken some dreadful disease exploring in back slums. Her mother is in a terrible state." "But is Eileen really ill?" asked Leslie, starting up. "So I have heard. They say she is rather bad. Oh, my dear, it is only the body. Pray don't worry." "But, Belle, this is intolerable. We cannot do without our bodies while we live. Poor Eileen ill! What did you say? Fever?" "I did not know that I did. But it is fever, typhoid or typhus, or something of that sort. I didn't quite catch the name. It may be smallpox, but I don't think so." "Belle, you are intolerable. Have you no sympathy?" "Intolerable?" said Belle. "Now, my dear Leslie, for goodness' sake, don't get commonplace. You may be quite certain that Eileen has the best doctors and the best nurses which London can afford. Does it help her that you should have that flush on your cheeks and that frown between your brows? Does it help her that you should abuse me? All this emotion is waste of sympathy." "I am sorry, but I must give it," said Leslie. "Dear Marjorie, how she will feel it! I must go and inquire after Eileen immediately." "I thought you were not well yourself." "I have a headache, but what does that matter? I must go to see Marjorie immediately, and to hear about Eileen." "If you want to make your inquiries properly," said Belle, "go by the Underground. It is so hot that you will feel yourself a real martyr. Put on your thickest coat and your heaviest hat, and then you will really enjoy yourself. Good-bye. I am going away, as I see it is your wish. I will come another day when you feel more like the Leslie Gilroy whom I used to admire at St. Wode's." "I will never be the Leslie that you admired if you wish me not to give sympathy to those in trouble," replied Leslie. She ran upstairs, put on her hat, took up her gloves, and went out. Chapter 24
of The Girls of St. Wode's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Girls of St. Wode by L.T. Meade. The Twins. Leslie arrived at the Chetwynds' house to see the street outside covered with straw. The knocker to the door was muffled. She rang the bell. The footman replied to her summons, said that Miss Eileen was very ill indeed, and that he did not believe the young lady could be admitted, but if she particularly wished it, he would go and inquire. He was just stepping on tiptoe across the hall when a face was pushed outside the sitting-room door, and the next moment Letty rushed up to Leslie. "Oh, do come in, Leslie," she cried. "I am so lonely and miserable. It would be an immense comfort to see anyone. Yes, Eileen is very ill indeed. The doctor says the typhoid is running a most severe course, and there are complications, a chance of pneumonia, if you know what that means. Come in, do. I know Aunt Helen won't mind my asking you in, and as to Marjorie—" "Oh, it is poor Marjorie I am so terribly anxious about," said Leslie. "How is she bearing up? They are so devoted to each other." "Well, really, Leslie, to be plain with you, Marjorie is in a very extraordinary state. She simply won't be reasonable. None of us can make her out, and the doctors are terribly annoyed with her. She cannot be got to leave Eileen's room. We cannot drag her away. Poor Aunt Helen is in a perfectly terrible state about her. Her face is completely changed. She won't eat anything, and only drops off to sleep when she is too tired to stay awake for a moment. Leslie, if anything happens to Eileen, Marjorie will die." "But surely, Letty, Eileen cannot be so bad as all that." "She is very bad, indeed, I can tell you. I don't think she can be much worse. There were 2 doctors here this morning, and there are 2 nurses, a day and a night nurse, on duty, and now Dr. Ericson wants to call in a 3rd. Eileen took that horrible fever in the buildings where the coachman lives, not a doubt of it." "But I didn't know that typhoid fever was really infectious," said Leslie. "In the ordinary sense it is not, but a whole family were down with it in a block, and Eileen would go to the house, and she was very hot and thirsty, and they gave her some water to drink, and now it seems that all the water was terribly contaminated. It had some of those queer little things they call bacilli in it, and Dr. Ericson said that they were bacilli of typhoid fever. How puzzling these modern scientific names are." Letty sank into an easy chair and invited Leslie to one by her side. "The fever is not infectious to us, you know," she continued, "and that in a kind of way is a comfort. Eileen began to be poorly and not herself a week ago. Now she is very ill and quite unconscious, and yet the very worst stage of the fever is yet to come. You cannot imagine the state poor Aunt Helen is in." "I earnestly wish I could help," said Leslie. "Well, you are helping when you come to see me, for I do want cheering up dreadfully. Belle Acheson was here for a moment or 2 this morning. What a terrible girl she is!" "I like her," replied Leslie. "I think she has a great deal in her. She at least is thoroughly out of the common." "I grant you that," answered Letty, "but preserve me from such uncommon people. Give me that everyday sort of character. Not," she added, "that I feel unkindly towards her, and I really did try to take compassion on her unfortunate wardrobe, but that, perhaps, was because I did not like the respectability of our dear old hall to be damaged by her thoroughly disreputable appearance. Dear, dear," added Letty, sighing gently, "ah, how far away all that seems now! We looked forward so much to the long vacation, and see what has happened. Eileen so terribly ill." Just at that moment the room door was opened, and Mrs. Chetwynd entered. She had never seen Leslie before, and rather resented her intrusion on the scene. "My dear Letty," she said, "I wish you would go up to Marjorie, for I cannot quiet her. She has left the sick room for a wonder and gone into her own, and there she has broken down in the most extraordinary manner. I tremble lest her cries and groans should reach Eileen's ears. Perhaps this young lady, I did not catch her name. Oh, Miss Gilroy. Perhaps Miss Gilroy, under the circumstances, you will excuse us." "Yes, Aunt Helen, I will go up," said Letty, "but I don't think I shall be of the least use. I seem to have lost all power of soothing or helping either of the girls. When I was with them at school, they rather deferred to my opinion on certain matters, but now all things are changed." "Don't stand talking there, dear. Do go," said Mrs. Chetwynd. "I will go, of course, but I warn you I shan't be of the least scrap of use. Good bye, Leslie. It was kind of you to call. Miss Gilroy is one of our special chums at college, Aunt Helen, and a great friend of both Eileen's and Marjorie's." "In that case, sit down for a minute or two, Miss Gilroy. Now run, Letty. Please don't wait another moment." Letty left the room, and Mrs. Chetwynd stared at Leslie. Leslie returned her gaze with one frank and sympathetic. "I am so truly sorry for you," she said in her soft voice. Her brown eyes gazed full into Mrs. Chetwynd's agitated face. "And I know what illness means," continued Leslie very softly, "for I beg your pardon, I mean my dear brother. He was terribly ill once, almost at death's door. Oh yes, I know what my mother suffered, and what we all felt, but he got quite well again, as strong as ever. We had a bad time, but it was over soon. It'll be just the same with Eileen, I feel convinced." "Oh, my dear child, if I could but believe it! I never felt such a terrible state in my life, and I know the doctors are most anxious. I must go back. I cannot add another word. Good bye. Thank you for coming. Your name is—" "Gilroy," said Leslie. "Thank you, Miss Gilroy, for coming. Letty will let you know how Eileen gets on." "I will call again tomorrow to inquire, if you will allow me," said Leslie. "Certainly, if you wish." The widow spoke in an indifferent tone. She opened the door, and Leslie was just going into the hall when Letty rushed downstairs. "Marjorie wants you, Leslie. You are to go straight up to her this minute." "Marjorie wishes to see Miss Gilroy?" interrupted Miss Chetwynd. "Yes, Aunt Helen, and a very good thing too. I just happened to mention that Leslie had called, and Marjorie said at once that she must see her, and no one in all the world could do her so much good. Go up to her, Leslie. Don't waste time talking." "May I?" said Leslie, looking anxiously at Mrs. Chetwynd. "Oh, certainly, dear, if she wishes it. But I must own—" "Come, come, Leslie, there is not a minute to lose," said Letty. They flew upstairs together, and a moment later had entered into Marjorie's room. Marjorie had flung herself face downwards on the bed. She was wearing an untidy serge skirt and a loose, ill-fitting washing blouse. Her tangled short hair was waved like a mop over her head. She did not look up when she heard the two girls enter the room, and when Leslie's soft voice said, "I am very sorry for you, Marjorie," her only reply was to clutch the pillow, round which she clasped her arms more convulsively than ever, and to say in a choking voice, "I wish Letty would go away. I know she is in the room too. I want to be alone with you, Leslie." Letty raised her brows, made a pantomimic sign to Leslie to show her how badly she was appreciated, and stole on tiptoe out of the room. "Has she gone?" asked Marjorie, still keeping her face hidden. "Yes." "Well, shut the door, won't you?" Leslie did so. "Turn the key in the lock, please." "Oh, Marjorie, is that right to your mother?" "I won't see mother, and I won't see Letty. Lock the door, will you, at once?" Leslie instantly turned the well-oiled key in the lock. When she had done so, Marjorie sat up, pushed the hair from her forehead, and looked at Leslie from between her swollen eyelids. "I feel so dazed," she said. Her face was red and inflamed in parts, and deadly white in other parts. Her eyes had sunk into her head, and their color was almost washed away with violent weeping. "Oh, come close, Leslie," she said, suddenly stretching out her arms. "Let me lean against you." Leslie went up to her. She clasped her own strong arms around her, laid the tired, flushed face against her breast, pushed back the hair with one of her hands, and began gently to stroke the hot cheek. "There, darling, there," said Leslie. She did not say anything more, not even "I am sorry for you," but she kept on repeating, "There, darling, there," until Marjorie, like a tired baby, closed her eyes and actually dropped off to sleep. Leslie sat motionless, bearing the weight of the tired girl's head on her shoulder. Marjorie slept for about 10 minutes. Then, with a violent start, she looked up, saw Leslie, and clutched hold of her with a fierce strain. "Oh, I've had such an awful dream," she said. "I thought you were here, but that you would not stay, and that Eileen was lying on the bed dead, and that you would not let me touch her. Oh, I'm so glad it was a dream, and that you are here. You will stay now, won't you? I can just bear to be away from Eileen when you are here, for you are not like the others. You seem to understand. Will you go and find Mother and ask her to let you stay with me?" "Could we not ring the bell and tell the servant, and perhaps your mother would come here?" "But I won't have her in the room. She does worry me so dreadfully." "She is in great trouble too," said Leslie. "You ought to be kind to her, Marjorie." "Oh, don't begin to lecture me. I can't stand it. You must let me have my own way now, whatever happens in the future. You have to come here of your own will, and go you shan't." "I will stay with you, if it will really comfort you," said Leslie. "What you want more than anything is a long quiet sleep, and you must have it. Lie down, and I will go find your mother." Marjorie flopped down again on the bed, seized the pillow, clasped it to her arms, and buried her head in it. Leslie unlocked the door and went out. On the landing a faint smell of carbolic and eau de cologne greeted her. She stood for a moment hesitating. As she did so, a nurse came out of the sick room. "I saw you standing there, and thought perhaps you wanted something," she said. "Yes, I want to find Mrs. Chetwynd," replied Leslie in a low voice. "She is in her room, and I hope asleep. Perhaps I can do something for you?" "I wish to see her. I have a message from Marjorie." "Poor child! I trust she is becoming more reasonable. What does she want, may I ask?" "She wishes me very much indeed to stay with her. She thinks she can bear to be away from Eileen if I am here." "Then for heaven's sake do grant her request. It is quite unnecessary to waken poor Mrs. Chetwynd to tell her this. In the interest of my patient, I take upon myself the responsibility of giving you permission to stay. Do you need any clothes? We can send a messenger presently." "I must write to my mother, who will send me what I require," replied Leslie. "Very well, I will go back to Marjorie now. You are quite certain that Mrs. Chetwynd won't mind?" "Mind? She will bless you." "Please, please, nurse, tell me before I go how Eileen really is." The nurse shook her head. "She is very ill indeed," she answered. "Do you mean," said Leslie, turning pale, "that there is danger?" "Don't ask me," said the nurse. "We are doing what we can for her, but in God's hand alone are the issues of life." She stole back into the sick room, and Leslie returned to Marjorie. Marjorie was now sitting up on the bed. Her chin rested on her hands. Her eyes, with a startled, strained look in them, turned slowly to Leslie when she entered the room. "I heard you talking to the nurse," she said. Did she tell you anything?" "Nothing special, dear, except that she was sure that I might stay here. I could not find your mother, and nurse took the responsibility of giving me leave." "Oh, of course you must stay. It is not that I mean. But did she tell you anything about Eileen?" "I asked if Eileen were in danger," said Leslie, "and she said, 'We are all doing what we can for her, but in God's hands are the issues of life.'" "Oh, then it is hopeless," said Marjorie. I always thought it was." She got off the bed as she spoke. She was trembling so excessively that she nearly fell. Leslie went up and tried to put an arm around her waist. "Don't touch me," said Marjorie. "I can't bear anyone to touch me now. It is all too true. They have been trying to keep the truth from me. Did I not read it in their faces? Even the doctors have deceived me, Leslie. Oh, Leslie, if you saw her now you would not know her." Marjorie came up close to Leslie as she spoke. "Her face is so sunken, and oh, so white, and her eyes so very big. You know what lovely eyes Eileen always had, so soft in expression, so full of the soul which animated all she ever did, or thought, or said. But now, Leslie, now if you could see them, they have sort of a spirit look. She was always unearthly, and now she is going away. She is going to the better and the spiritual world. And oh Leslie, I can't bear it." Marjorie turned away and walked to the window, rested her elbow on the sill, and looked out. "I cannot bear it. I cannot bear it," she repeated at intervals. Leslie remained motionless for a few minutes. She was thinking hard. "Of course," she said after a long pause, "there is only one thing to be done." "Only one thing, yes, I know what you mean. I am to quiet myself, to crush back my misery, my despair. Yes, I'll do it. I'll wash my face and hands, and make my hair tidy, and go back to her again. She never loved any one in all the world as she loved me. I am her twin, you know, and twins are so close to each other, 50 times closer than the ordinary brother and sister. I'll go back to her, and I'll stay so quiet that even the nurses won't have anything to complain of. You need not remain in this house after all, Leslie, for I cannot be with you. I must return to my darling, and by so doing be dreadfully selfish and injure her," said Leslie. "Selfish and injure her?" repeated Marjorie. "Yes, injure her, and take away the faint chance there may be of her life." "But you cannot mean that, Leslie. What possible harm can I do her? How perfectly ridiculous you are! I injure my own Eileen! Why do you speak in that way? It is impossible that I should injure her." "I know you will injure her if you go back. You don't look natural, Marjorie. You must try to subdue your emotion. You are much too flushed. Your eyes are too full of anxiety. The very tone in your voice is all strain. Now, Eileen ought to have no anxious person in the room with her. So much depends on all that sort of thing being kept out of the sick room. And dear," Leslie's voice shook, "I don't know if I ought to say it, and yet I will. There is one thing to be done." "Speak! How mysterious you are!" "Let us pray for her, Marjorie. Let us ask God to save her. It is all in His hands. Let us ask Him to spare her life." Marjorie stared at Leslie. Then she clutched hold of her hand, squeezed it, and said eagerly, Do you think He will?" "I cannot say, but we might try. He will if it is right." "Then let us go straight off to a church and ask Him. I will always feel as if I could pray better in a church." "Yes, we will go at once," said Leslie. Chapter 24.
Chapter 25 of The Girls of St. Wode's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Claire. The Girls of St. Wode's by L. T. Meade. Chapter 25. The Prayer of Faith. In her shabby serge dress, the marks of tears still round her eyes, her cheeks flushed, her short hair tossed, Marjorie Chetwynd ran downstairs, accompanied by Leslie. Mrs. Chetwynd was still lying in her room trying to have a little rest. Letty was writing letters to anxious friends. The girls had just opened the door when they saw Belle Acheson coming up the steps. "How is she now?" said Belle. "Why, dear me, Leslie, how very quickly you got here, and you look as if you were quite at home. How is Eileen, Marjorie? By the way, you look rather bad yourself." "Please don't speak about me. It doesn't matter whether I am ill or well," replied Marjorie. "Don't keep me now, Belle. Eileen is as ill as she can be, and I am going to pray for her. Leslie says that is the only thing to do, and we are both going to church. Will you come with us? Surely the more who pray to God, the better." "I will certainly come," replied Belle quietly. She turned at once, and the girls walked down the street side by side. There was a church at the farther end of the square, a church which was open all day to those who needed it. The three girls entered. It was hot outside, but here it was still and cool. They walked up the aisle and turned into one of the pews and knelt down. Marjorie knelt in the middle. Her head was pressed upon her hands. Leslie had always found prayer easy. In her short life she had prayed a good deal, finding prayer the greatest support in each hour of trial. But of late, since her own great trouble had come, she had almost forgotten to pray, and now it seemed difficult. It was not until she ceased to remember herself and thought only of her friend that her words went up to God, at first in broken utterances, then more earnestly and more full of faith. A low sob came from Marjorie's lips. This sob was echoed by Leslie. Belle had taken up a prayer book, had opened it, and was reading in a semi-whisper some of the prayers for the sick. After a very few moments, Marjorie rose to her feet. "I have prayed," she said. "I have told God exactly what I want. He will hear. He must. It would be wrong, cruel, monstrous for Eileen, beautiful Eileen, to die. Come home now, Leslie," she continued. The three left the church as silently as they had entered. It was not until they reached Marjorie's door that Belle spoke. "Good-bye, Marjorie," she said, holding out her hand. "Good-bye. I will call again. But before I go, do tell me, if you seriously believe in all this." Said Marjorie. She hesitated. The look of peace which had dawned upon her worn and anxious face left it. Before she could reply, Leslie answered with flashing eyes. "Marjorie believes, or she could not have prayed as she did. And of course I believe," she continued. "I believe in a God, and that He answers prayer." "I wonder if He will," said Belle, with a queer, new sort of expression on her face. "It will be very strange. I shall be most curious to know. Good-bye, Marjorie. Good-bye, Leslie." She turned and walked down the street. When she had gone a couple of 100 yards, she turned back, and called out to the other girls, who were still standing on the steps of the house. "I will come to-morrow to find out. It will be very curious if it is true. It will make an immense difference to me." Then she walked on, swaying slightly from side to side. Marjorie put her hand quickly to her forehead. "I never felt less in sympathy with Belle than I do at this moment," she said. "Now you, Leslie, really soothe me. It was nice to feel you kneeling by my side. It seemed to me that some of your faith came to me. I do not feel nearly so unhappy now, not so restless, nor so uncertain." Leslie kissed her. "I can understand that," she said. "You have put the matter into God's hands. You are resting on God. That is the reason why you do not feel so miserable." The girls entered the little boudoir which Mrs. Chetwynd had so carefully prepared for her darlings. Letty was seated by the window. "Where have you both been?" she cried. "I have been looking for you everywhere. Aunt Helen is in a painful state of excitement." "What about?" "Well, nurse did not much like Eileen's state, and Dr. Ericson came in a hurry, and he says he wishes another doctor to be called in, one of the very great specialists." The doctor is coming almost immediately. Aunt Helen says we are none of us to go upstairs. There is to be the most absolute quiet, and fresh straw has been ordered to be put down in the street. Leslie, are you really going to stay here?" "She certainly is," said Marjorie. "I wouldn't part with her on any account." "I will write a line to mother if you will allow me," said Leslie. "Of course, if I can be of the least use to Marjorie, I shall be glad to stay." "Here is paper if you want it," said Letty. "I am very glad you are staying, for my part." Leslie wrote a short note. When it was finished, Letty took it from the room. "I cannot sympathize with Letty either," said Marjorie when Letty was gone. Then she sat down by the window and did not speak any more. Sometimes she closed her eyes, and sometimes Leslie, who had taken up a book and was trying to read, fancied she saw her lips moving. Was she once again praying to God? Was faith, the first real faith she had ever known, truly visiting her heart, and helping her through this dark hour of tribulation? Mrs. Chetwynd did not come downstairs again, and presently the footman appeared, and told the girls that dinner was ready. "I cannot eat," said Marjorie. "Eat, when all that makes life valuable hangs in the balance?" "But you must eat, dear," said Leslie. "You will feel much worse if you do not. Come with me." "Do, Marjorie, try not to be such a humbug," said Letty in an almost cross voice. "You don't know how you add to the trouble of everybody when you go on in that silly way. First of all, Leslie, she absolutely immured herself in Eileen's room, refused to leave it day or night, and distracted poor Aunt Helen and the nurse, and now that she has come out of the room, she is doing her utmost to make herself ill." "Don't say any more," cried Marjorie. "I will come downstairs." Her face was white as death. The three girls entered the dining room. Leslie's persuasions, joined, perhaps, to some of Letty's tartar remarks, induced Marjorie to take a little food, but the oppression and solemnity of the scene seemed to have got into the air. Presently, the sound of wheels, muffled as they drove over the straw, was distinctly heard, and then two doctors' broughams drew up at the door. Dr. Ericson got out of his, and an elderly, benevolent-looking man out of the other. They both entered the house. "What shall I do?" cried Marjorie. "I cannot stand this." "Oh, I feel somehow it will be all right, and remember we have prayed about it," said Leslie. She went up to Marjorie. "Come back to the boudoir," she said. "You are nearer to her there." "Well, I shall stay here," said Letty. "I don't know what there is about you, Leslie, and about Marjorie, but the pair of you make me feel quite nervous. We are doing all we can, that is, Aunt Helen is, and really I do think that one ought to try to retain a little strength of mind. If the very worst of all had happened, you could not be going on more terribly than you are at present, Marjorie." "I cannot help feeling, if that is what you mean," said Marjorie. She went upstairs, and Leslie followed her. The noise of people walking overhead was heard. "They are in her room now," said Marjorie. She clutched hold of Leslie still tighter. "Oh, Leslie, what should I do if you were not with me? You know she is my twin. No one was ever quite so near to me. We think the same, we do everything the same. All our pursuits, all our desires, are the same. I cannot live without her. If she dies, I shall die." "But she shall not die, dear." "Oh, I know, but she is in such terrible danger now. You said, Leslie, that if it were good for her, God would spare her. And He will, Marjorie. Cannot you try to understand? If it is best for her to go to God, He will not leave her in the world just because you selfishly wish it. But it may be best for her to stay here. She may have much to do yet in her life on earth." "If she is spared, I shall become religious at once," said Marjorie. Leslie could not help smiling. "Were you not religious before?" she asked. "Oh, after a fashion, but never the real thing. Eileen and I both professed a little, and Eileen, the darling, was, I believe, in earnest, but I don't think I ever was. I wanted, of course, to lead a useful life, and I thought myself very much better than Mother or Mrs. Acheson. I believe now that I was selfish about Mother. Perhaps we both were, even darling Eileen. But, you know, she always did what I did. I was the first to suggest a thing, and then Eileen followed suit. If we were selfish, she was not to blame. Leslie, the doctors are coming downstairs. I wonder if they will tell us anything. I know mother won't for a long, long time." "I'll go and ask, then," said Leslie, jumping up. She went to the door, opened it, and stepped on to the landing. The two doctors came downstairs. "And what young lady is this?" said Dr. Howard, pausing for a moment and looking at her. He was a tall and very benevolent-looking man, with white hair and dark eyes. "I want to know," said Leslie. She paused. Marjorie had not dared to come out of the boudoir. "I want to know the truth, if there is any hope." "Are you the sister of the young lady?" asked the medical man. "No, only a great friend, but her sister, her twin sister, is in the other room, and she wants to know, and cannot find out." "I understand. Too upset to ask, poor girl," said the doctor. "Ericson, if you will permit me, I will go in and see that young lady." "Oh, how kind of you!" said Leslie. She opened the door, and both doctors went in. Marjorie had flung herself down in a chair and covered her face with her hands. "Now, my dear girl, what is this?" said Dr. Howard. "We shall be having two patients instead of one if this sort of thing goes on. Give me your hand. I assure you, Ericson, this young lady's pulse is bounding at such a rate that we shall have her in a fever if we don't look out. This will never do. As to your sister, Miss Chetwynd—" "Oh, what about her?" cried Marjorie. She flung down her hands and looked up at the doctor with eyes full of agony. "Good gracious, what a likeness between the two!" said Dr. Howard. "Well, my dear, I will tell you the simple truth. I know you will be a brave girl. Your sister is in danger. A bad case of typhoid fever always means that, you understand. But I have hope, and so has my friend Ericson, that we shall pull her through. There is no cause for immediate anxiety, but much depends on the next 24 hours. Ericson is going to stay up tonight with your sister, and as for you, Miss Marjorie, you must go to bed and have a rest." "I am sorry to tell you, Dr. Howard," said Dr. Ericson, "that Miss Marjorie has been behaving in a very natural, but also a very reprehensible manner. She has insisted on living in her sister's room, has done herself no good, and—" "Oh, well, as you say, that is natural," said Dr. Howard, who could read character like a book. "Poor child, she feels this terribly. Give her a sleeping draught, Ericson, won't you? And now, my dear, go to bed as soon as possible, and leave your sister's case in our hands, and," he added, dropping his voice to a whisper, "in the hands of a better physician." He left the room. When he had done so, Marjorie burst into tears. "Oh, now I can breathe, now I can sleep," she said. "The hard and terrible strain has left my heart. Yes, Leslie, I shall sleep tonight. I am dead tired." End of chapter 25. Recording by Claire.
Chapter 26 of The Girls of St. Wode's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pam Castile. The Girls of St. Wode's by L.T. Meade. Chapter 26. Annie's Request. The next day Marjorie awoke from her long sleep with a stunned feeling at her heart, but no longer quite such a keen sense of despair. She clung to Leslie and would scarcely let her out of her sight. The doctors were rather anxious about her. She was scarcely likely to take the fever, but if she exhausted herself in the way she was doing, she might be laid up with a severe nervous attack. Accordingly, Mrs. Chetwynd implored Leslie to remain with them, and Leslie, having received a note from her mother to say that she was only too glad she was making herself useful, agreed to do so. On the afternoon of that same day, Marjorie went to lie down. There was absolute stillness in the house, for Letty had gone out to spend the afternoon with a friend. The sick girl was fighting death in the room overhead, and Leslie found herself alone in the pretty boudoir. It was a charming room, furnished with every taste and luxury, but Leslie, as she lay back in a deep chair, had a strange feeling of inertia and lassitude all over her. She was glad to be with Marjorie, but the depression which had so often visited her of late was on this afternoon worse than ever. Mr. Parker's attitude to her yesterday kept recurring again and again to her memory. The cold, almost disdainful look he had given her, the effort to appear as usual before her mother and brother and sisters, the single failure of that effort kept coming back to her. He had done much for her. She had taken an enormous favor from his hands. Now what a terrible position she found herself in. Oh, Llewellyn was right after all. He would not take a money favor from anyone. How she wished she had been equally determined. In the midst of these meditations she heard a ring at the front door. The next moment the footman came up, opened the door of the boudoir, and ushered in a visitor. Leslie started to her feet. A vexed exclamation came to her lips, and with difficulty remained unspoken, for Annie Colchester stood before her. "I followed you here, Leslie," said Annie. "Can I see you at once and by yourself?" "Certainly," said Leslie. Her tone was cold. "Sit down, Annie." Annie did not sit. She came quickly across the room and looked full at Leslie. "You know, of course," she said abruptly, "that I have come down from St. Wode's?" "Yes, and how did you pass your final?" "I took an ordinary, no more, and now I want some work to do." "Of course." "How cold you look, Leslie, so different from what you were when first I met you at St. Wode's." "Never mind about me," answered Leslie. "Do you want me to help you? Have you come on that account?" "Yes, I have come to you on that account, for you can help me. I went to your house this morning and heard you were out. It was of the most vital importance that I should see you. So I got your address from your mother. She was unwilling to give it to me at first, for she said you were staying in a house of illness. But I begged so hard that at last she gave way, and here I am." "Well, what is it?" asked Leslie. Her tone was still icy cold, and the want of sympathy in her eyes caused Annie's dark red-brown ones to flash angrily. "Oh, you are one of those dreadfully Puritan, goody-goody people," she said, "who always hate an unfortunate sinner. I would not like you to be my judge at the great assize." "You must not talk to me in that tone," said Leslie, stung in her turn. "You know what you have done. You have changed all my life." "You don't mean to say you are still fretting over that matter? What can it signify to you whether Mr. Parker thinks badly of you or not? Just consider for a moment what would have happened if you had betrayed me that time." "It might have been the better for me and for you, too, if I had spoken the truth," said Leslie. "I am sometimes inclined to believe that I did wrong to shield you." "Wrong to shield me? Why, I should have been expelled, ruined, absolutely ruined for life." "But I should not be feeling as bitter as I now do." "You would have been so miserable you would not have cared to live," said Annie with conviction. "But now don't let us hark back on that affair. I want you to do something for me, and at once. Can you possibly come out with me? I want you to come with me to Mr. Parker." "To Mr. Parker? And with you? No, Annie, that I cannot do." "But you must. Listen to me, Leslie." Annie suddenly fell on her knees and took one of Leslie's hands in hers. "How luxurious this room is," she said. She looked around it as she spoke, glancing at the curtained windows, the pictured walls, the comfortable chair in which Leslie was seated. "Your friends are rich," she continued, "and although your home is plain enough, yet you have never wanted. I wonder, Leslie, if you were ever hungry, hungry to the point of starvation." "What do you mean?" asked Leslie. "Oh, you'd know very well if you had suffered. Now, I have. Let me show you the money I have in my pocket." She slipped her hand into her pocket, took out her purse, and tumbled its contents into Leslie's lap. "I don't want to see," said Leslie. "But you must look. See, here is a 10-shilling piece, and here are 4 shillings. 10 and 4 make 14. That is all I possess, absolutely all, and I have not a friend in the world. My brother—" "Your brother is in Australia?" "Never mind where he is. If he keeps his promise to you, I must never see him again. He must never come back to England. But listen, this has nothing to do with my brother. It has to do with me. I could scarcely live on less than 2 shillings a day, which means that I have exactly a week in which to spend my money. At the end of that time, where am I?" She stood up and held out her empty palms. "Now listen, Leslie. I know Mr. Parker does not like me, and he never liked Rupert. It is true he was kind to me, for he helped to pay for my education at St. Wode's. If I had taken a first class at my final, I could have got a good situation as a teacher, although I hate teaching, for I am too impatient and too dreamy. But as I have only barely taken an ordinary, all that sort of thing is hopeless. Besides, even if it were not hopeless, there is nothing vacant. I must live while I am waiting for a situation. Now, Mr. Parker wants a secretary. He wants a girl to come to his office every day to write his letters and to attend generally to his correspondence, and I intend to secure that post. I am told that he offers his secretary 2 guineas a week. I mean to be that secretary. I mean to earn that money. He won't give me the post, though, because he does not like me well enough. But if you come with me and plead for me, just because he likes you, because he loves you, he will give the post to me. Can you come now at once? I was at his office this morning. I did not say who I was, and do you know, there were 20 girls waiting to see him for this one situation? They all looked capable and clever, the sort who would write his letters and attend to his correspondence and keep things going for him. But every one of those 20 girls are to be disappointed, for I am to be the successful one. I shall be, if you will speak a good word for me. Come, Leslie, will you do this for me? But do you quite realize what you are asking? Said Leslie. To demand a favor of Mr. Parker? Annie, you cannot know what this means. I will speak to you frankly. My heart has been cold as a stone to you. You have made my life all gall and bitterness. Oh, folly, said Annie. Remember, I shall starve. Only 14 shillings between me and the world. But Mr. Parker will not give you the situation if I ask him, continued Leslie. He scarcely speaks to me now if we meet. How can I ask him to do me a favor? Annie, you expect too much. Annie stared very hard at Leslie. Then she rose to her feet. There was a look of despair in her eyes. Her cheeks were ghastly white. 14 shillings, she said in a whisper. She returned her purse to her pocket and looked again at Leslie. Are you sure you won't yield? She said. Remember, whatever you do must be done today. He is going to decide today. Leslie struggled with herself. Just at that moment the door was quickly opened, and Marjorie rushed in. There was a queer look on Marjorie's face, traces of recent tears in her eyes, and a softness about her mouth. She went up to Leslie and kissed her. She did not see Annie at all. Eileen is better, she cried. She has had a long, quiet sleep, and the nurse says she is certainly better. The doctors have just gone too, and they believe that she is on the mend. They think that the worst is over. Leslie, God did hear our prayers. I shall believe in God now as long as ever I live. I wish Belle Acheson would come, in order that I might tell her how God heard our prayers. Yes, I shall believe in him as long as I live. It was your thought, Leslie, your splendid thought, and it has succeeded. Oh, I am so happy. She kissed Leslie again and ran out of the room as quickly as she had entered. She did not even notice Annie Colchester, who stood near the window. When Marjorie closed the door behind her, Leslie looked full at Annie. What can it all mean? Said Annie. How queer Marjorie Chetwynd looked. No wonder, said Leslie. Her sister Eileen was at death's door, but she is a little better today. Only Marjorie talked some humbug about prayer. Did she imagine that you prayed? I thought you were too hard. No, no, said Leslie, with a catch in her voice and a suppressed sob. I am a miserable girl, but it does not matter, Annie. I will do what you wish. Then you are an angel after all. I thought you one once, and so did Rupert, but you yourself choked us off. Well, come with me now. You are an angel after all. The words were scarcely out of Annie's lips. Her hand, hot and trembling with excitement, had scarcely touched Leslie's sleeve before the door was thrown open and Belle Acheson was announced. Belle came in with a queer, eager look on her face, a kind of hungry, half-starved look. She went straight up to Leslie. I did not ask the man at the door, she said. I didn't wish to. I felt I would rather get the news, good or bad, from you. Do you know what a queer thing happened? I was so impressed by what you told me yesterday that I, Belle Acheson, began to pray in real earnest. All night long I kept asking God to spare Eileen. Now the question is, has he done so? Leslie, how is Eileen? Is she better? She is, Belle. Oh, she is, cried Leslie. It is too wonderful, but it is true. God has heard all our prayers. It is only a moment back that dear Marjorie ran into the room and told me that Eileen was better." "Thank you," replied Belle. "You need not say any more." She turned her back on Leslie and walked to the window. She stood there behind the shelter of the curtains and looked out. No one knew what she saw or what she felt. After a time she looked round. "Then it is all right," she said. "There is a God who answers prayers. Eileen will get well again. It is a great thing for a girl to discover the truth of that. It makes a great difference in her life. It is quite too interesting and too wonderful. It makes everything worth while, somehow. Oh, there, I cannot speak about it." She stopped abruptly. Leslie did not reply, but Annie now ran up to Belle. "Don't you know me?" she said. "Or are you too absorbed with this wonderful discovery to notice that I am one of the St. Wode's girls?" "Of course I know you. You are Annie Colchester, the queer, extraordinary girl who was almost as enthusiastic as I am to win distinction, to solve problems, to acquire the great, the glorious possession of knowledge." "I am the same," answered Annie, "although in some ways my views have changed." "Don't tell me so. If you are one of those who put their hand to the plow and then look back, I will have nothing to do with you. By the way, you have passed your exam before now. How have you succeeded?" "I have not succeeded at all. That is, I have only just taken an ordinary." "And you meant to take first class in honors?" "Yes." "Then you have done poorly." "I know I have," replied Annie, hanging her head. "Let me look at you," said Belle. She went straight up to her, put her hand under Annie's chin, and lifted up the blushing face. "And yet you have a fine, well-developed brow," she said. "Plenty of brains there, and your eyes are clear and dancing with intelligence. Stay, though. Let me feel your pulse." She caught Annie's wrist between her finger and thumb. Belle herself was all eagerness now. Her attitude was that of one who stood at attention. "Come," she said. I'm not a doctor, but I don't like that pulse. One moment it seems to be running away, the next it stops dead. Then it is wobbly, quite uncertain. Annie Colchester, do you eat enough?" "Don't question me," answered Annie. Belle's gray eyes traveled to Leslie's face. Leslie's lips formed a voiceless no. Belle understood her. "By the way, where are you staying?" she asked, turning again to Annie. "Have you any friends in town?" "I have no special friends. I am in lodgings." "What address?" "I cannot give you an address, because I am leaving today." "Then that is delightful. You shall come home with me." "With you? Do you mean it?" "Of course I mean it. I am not in the habit of saying things I don't mean. I should consider such conduct a breach of truth. Do you imagine for a moment that I am a liar? I, who wish to cultivate all the sacred virtues, to stoop to a lie? When I ask you to come home with me, I wish to have you. I want a friend to keep me company, an intelligent friend. You shall stay with me for a week at least. I don't believe in that failure of yours. If you did not take honors, you ought to have taken them. That brow and those eyes were not given you for nothing. By the way, did I ever mention to you, no, I don't think I did, that I am starting a little hostel of my own, that I am saving money for it? I do not know the exact sum that I have saved, but it is not very far from £100. You are one of the girls I should like to live with me there. You are just the sort to fling aside every weight and devote yourself heart and soul to the acquiring of glorious knowledge." "I have felt like that now and then," said Annie, "but somehow the motive has gone. It is unfair, absolutely unfair for me to come to you on false pretenses." "Oh, whether you are clever or not, you look as if you wanted a week's rest. I am very happy today. What occurred has given me, I cannot exactly tell you what, but a wonderful feeling. I am in the humor to do a good deed, and you are the person who wants it done. You want rest and good nourishment and peace. You have been tossed about in a sore battle. I do not know where, and I do not know how, but the proof lies in the queer, desolate expression of your face. My home is comfortable, and mother always does exactly what I like. So come at once." "I thank you from my heart, and I will come," said Annie. "It is a great boon to me, but I must first go out with Leslie Gilroy." "Off with you then at once. I don't want to pry into any secrets, but Leslie, when you have done with her, bring her or send her back to me. You know the old address in Maida Vale. Good-bye for the present." End of chapter 26. Recording by Pam Castile.
Chapter 27 of the Girls of St. Wode's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sarah and Gracia Partial. The Girls of St. Wode's by L.T. Meade. Chapter 27. Tell me the truth, Leslie. This is a wonderful thing for me, said Annie as she stood up. Leslie turned and looked at her without replying. I mean that my 14 shillings can now last me nearly another week. By that time, if I get this situation, I shall have saved money and be quite independent. Leslie, you cannot imagine what a load will be lifted from my mind, and you will have done it. I shall thank you to the longest day I live. But I don't want to do it, said Leslie. You don't know how dreadful I feel. Pray, don't say any more to me. I am not good now, not at all. I want to be away by myself, to fight this thing out to the bitter end. But here we are. I'll do my best for you, Annie. Only for heaven's sake, don't thank me. The girls found themselves now in Queen Victoria Street. They reached the house where Mr. Parker's offices were, and went upstairs to the second floor, and presently entered a room where several clerks were busy. You must take the initiative now, said Annie, touching Leslie on the arm. They know me, for I have been here often, but they do not know you. Go up to one of the clerks and say that you wish to see Mr. Parker. Again Leslie found herself hesitating, but she quickly made up her mind. She must go on with what she meant to do at any cost. She crossed the room, therefore, quickly, and stood before a desk where an elderly man with gray hair was writing. I have come to see Mr. Parker, said Leslie. Is he in? Mr. Parker is in, miss, was the reply, but he is specially engaged. Is he likely to be disengaged soon? Asked Leslie. He is interviewing some young ladies for a... Oh, I know, said Annie, who had followed Leslie across the room. Be quick, Leslie, quick. I want to see Mr. Parker on that very subject, replied Leslie. What, miss? Said the clerk. Are you one of the candidates? No, not exactly, but all the same I have come on that very business. If you will give me a sheet of paper, I will write a note. The man handed her one, and she scribbled a few words. Leslie Gilroy wants to see you at once. Please don't engage a secretary finally until you have heard what I want to say. She folded up the paper and handed it to the clerk. Will you take that to Mr. Parker now? She said. He will look at it even when he is talking with another person. Oh, how good you are, whispered Annie in her ear. Another clerk motioned to the girls to seat themselves on a bench not far from the door. The elderly clerk with the gray hair went into a room at the opposite side. He was absent for a couple of minutes. When he returned, he went straight up to Leslie. Mr. Parker will see you in 5 minutes, he said. Will you come this way? May I come too? Asked Annie. Leslie looked at the clerk. Certainly, miss. Bring your friend. He spoke in a respectful tone, and ushered the girls into a small and comfortably furnished apartment. Having supplied them with a newspaper each, he left them. This suspense is almost intolerable, said Annie. You promise, Leslie, that you will plead very, very hard. I will do my best, answered Leslie. But I know you are hating it, said poor Annie. I see it in your face. Don't talk to me about that, Annie. I have made up my mind, but I cannot talk it over with you. Just then the door was opened, and Mr. Parker himself came in. He glanced at Annie in some annoyance and surprise, and gave Leslie that cold, level glance which had almost broken her heart on the day of the picnic. I understand that you want to speak with me, he said. Leslie rose. I do, she said. Can I see you by yourself? You can if you have come on a very urgent matter, but as a rule I never see anyone here except on business. This is truly a matter of business. Has Miss Colchester anything to do with it? Yes. Then I had better see you alone. Come this way. He took no further notice of Annie, but ushered Leslie into the next room. Closing the door, he asked her to seat herself. Now, what is it? He said. I can scarcely tell you how painful it is to me to come to you today, began Leslie. Then why do you do it? Said Mr. Parker. Because I want to ask you for a favor. Ah, to lend you another £60? Leslie's face turned very white. Do you know that you, my father's old friend, are cruel? She said. I don't think so. On the contrary, I consider I am most forbearing. A girl who can go into debt once and conceal it from her friends and send another girl. Mr. Parker, you break my heart. Again, I repeat I am sorry, but I must have my say. I cannot grant your request, whatever it is, except in my own fashion. Now speak up, and be quick. Being Leslie Gilroy, of course I cannot refuse you anything in reason. You are doing much for me. I know it is for my mother's sake and my father's sake. That's about it. And never more for my sake? My feelings have changed toward you. The more I think over that black business, the less I like it. I cannot pretend to be other than I am. Well, I have not come here to plead for myself today, replied Leslie. She is very poor, nearly starving. She has heard that you want a secretary. Mr. Parker raised his brows, and an ominous exclamation dropped from his lips. You must hear me out, continued Leslie. She knows that you do not like her brother. Scoundrel, muttered the merchant between his teeth. But she is not to be held accountable for her brother's sins. Did I ever say she was? No, but you act somehow as if you did. Oh, I am not going to be afraid of you, Mr. Parker. I will speak out. A brother may be wicked, and a sister good and virtuous. You think her good and virtuous? Interrupted the merchant. Leslie hastily proceeded, as if she had not heard this remark. I want you to make Annie your secretary, she said. She feels sure that you would refuse her own request, and she has asked me to plead with you. I do plead most earnestly, because I am my father's daughter, and because you were once fond of me and good to me. Anne is a very clever girl. She knows many foreign languages. She has a great deal of shrewdness in her character, and would do your work admirably. I want you to let her do it. And you intend to be responsible for her character? Her character? Oh, said Leslie. She trembled and colored. Mr. Parker fixed her with his keen, twinkling eyes. He seemed to be dragging the truth out of her soul. If he knew even for one moment how Annie had gotten the money, if he knew about the forged letter, would he give her the post? And you are, personally, very desirous about this? Said Mr. Parker. I am indeed, under the circumstances. It is bitterly hard for me to have to plead with you, for my whole heart aches, yes, whether you will believe it or not, at the cruel change in our positions. You, to whom I owe so much, think badly of me. But I have risen to this great effort on Annie's behalf. Don't let me have to humble myself in vain. Would there have been anything so humiliating in asking a favor of your father's greatest friend? Said Mr. Parker, a kinder note coming into his voice. It would not have been humiliating at all, but under the changed circumstances it is. Aye, they have changed truly, but because of your father and our old friendship, I will do what you wish, Leslie Gilroy, but on a condition. Oh, I will promise anything. I am so grateful to you. Stop a moment, young lady. Wait till you have heard what my condition is. I will do what you wish. I will give your friend that post, if you will tell me the truth with regard to that £60. Leslie turned from white to red. I thought, she began. No, young lady, no, said Mr. Parker. I can read character well enough, and you have never told me the truth with regard to that money. There is something concealed at the back of it. The more I think, the more assured I am, and your face tells me so plainly at the present moment. When I know the simple truth, Leslie Gilroy, I will restore you to my full power again, and your friend shall be my private secretary. There is nothing more to be said, replied poor Leslie, trembling from head to foot. I cannot tell you more than you know already. What I know already is not the truth. Go, child, tell your friend that you have failed, and that the fault is yours. Leslie walked across the floor. Mr. Parker preceded her and flung open the door. He followed Leslie into Annie's presence. He stood and faced Annie Colchester. I understand, he said, bringing out his words coldly, that you have asked Leslie Gilroy to come here and plead for you. You want to be my secretary. I could do the work well, said Annie, standing up and speaking with glistening eyes. Your brother also assured me that he could do my work well. He has brains enough, but nothing else, the scoundrel. Annie bit her lips till the blood nearly came. She made a valiant effort not to speak, but to hear Rupert abused was like dragging her through fire. Now listen to me, said Parker. I have spoken to Leslie Gilroy. I have told her that I will grant her request when she tells me the whole truth about that £60 which you took from me to her. It is true I have her letter, but it was not only her letter, it was your pleading which induced me to give it. Since that hour I have felt certain that something is hidden. When Leslie tells me the exact truth, you, Annie Colchester, shall have the place. You had better go away, both of you girls, and consult. There is something at the back of this. I will keep the post open for 48 hours, but no longer. Now go. You have my decision. End of chapter 27. Tell me the truth, Leslie. Recording by Sarah and Gracia Partial. sarahpartial.blogspot.com.
Chapter 28 of The Girls of St. Wode's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Girls of St. Wode's by L. T. Meade. Chapter 28. Rupert. When the girls found themselves once more in the open air, neither of them spoke. Then Annie said in a rasping sort of voice, "I see quite well, Leslie, that it is all useless. I give up the hope which seemed so bright a short time ago. You have done your very best, and I thank you from my heart. I will go to Belle Aitchison now. Perhaps something will turn up at the end of a week. At any rate, I have that week to turn round in." "We will go to the bank," said Leslie. "Omnibuses go from there in all directions. As to what Mr. Parker said, you know, Annie, that it remains with yourself." "And do you think," said Annie, colouring and shivering, "that if I could bring myself to tell the real truth, I should get the post?" "I think so, for Mr. Parker is a man who never goes back on his word. He promised to give it to you if the truth were known. He made no condition." "And you will be restored to his favour?" "I have nothing to say," replied Leslie, somewhat proudly. "I will not plead for myself. You won't get the post you covet unless the truth is known." "I cannot do it," said Annie. "It would be betraying not only myself, but Rupert. Can you find your way back to the Chetwynds?" "Certainly I can. And that is your omnibus, with Maida Vale marked on it." Leslie held up her parasol, and the driver stopped. Annie got in. Leslie nodded to her and turned away. Annie shrank back in her corner. She shut her eyes. Her head was aching violently. Her one desire, the only desire that she had at that moment, was not to tell, but to hide the truth. The secretaryship would have saved her. It would have enabled her to live respectably and in comfort, but it was not to be hers. Between it and her lay a sin which she committed for the one she loved best in the world. Now she had to think how she was to manage. Where could she get work? What work could she best undertake? How long would Belle keep her as a guest? Belle was known to be erratic and uncertain. Well, at least for a week she was safe. During that time she would treasure her shillings as if they were gold. The drive was a long one, but presently she reached her destination. The omnibus drew up. She alighted, and turned forlornly into the square where Belle lived with her mother. Belle's house was number 30. It was at the left-hand side of the square. Annie had nearly reached it when she felt a hand laid lightly on her shoulder. She turned round in an access of terror. Then a cry of mingled astonishment, fear, and delight burst from her, and the next instant she had clasped her arms round her brother's neck. "Oh, Rupert!" she cried, "where did you come from? I thought you were at the other side of the world." "I will tell you all," replied Rupert in a cheerful voice. "There's no manner of use in your giving way, and don't, for goodness' sake, hug me in public, Annie. Of course I'm not in Australia. I never went there. I'm not such a fool. Do you think it's likely I would leave this place when I had £60 in my pocket?" "But you owed that money. It was given you to pay a debt." "Well, I paid part of it, not all. The fellows were only too glad to get £20 from me. So you see, my dear little sister, I had £40 left to go on the spree with. But now my creditors are clamouring for the second instalment. Annie, my dear, I want your help again, and what is more, I must have it. You little guessed, when you were shrinking up in that corner of the omnibus, that I was enjoying a cigar on the roof. I hurried down when you alighted, and have followed you. That precious goody-goody Miss Gilroy little knew how close I was to her vicinity when she bade you good-bye at the bank. Oh, Rupert, I am so terribly frightened, and yet it is a real joy to see you." "Poor old girl," said Rupert, patting Annie on her shoulder. "You always were affectionate. You've got me out of more than one scrape, and you'll get me out of this one, won't you, kiddie? Now, where can we go for a real good talk?" "I don't know this part of London," replied Annie. "Well, it's like any other part, I suppose. You must talk in the streets, but it's abominably hard. What is your address, Annie? Where are you staying?" "I am just going to spend a week with Mrs. Aitchison. She lives at number 30 in this square. Newbolt Square it is called." "Number 30, Newbolt Square. Then here we are. I'll come and see you. Nothing more natural." "But, Rupert, you must not. It would be most dangerous." "Why should it be dangerous? Why should not a bona fide brother go to see his only sister? You are my sister, Annie." "And I glory in the fact," said Annie. "Whatever you do, I shall always feel glad that I belong to you. You will always be the darling of my heart. But, oh, Rupert, if Leslie finds out that you have broken your word, it is in her to be very hard. She is hard already. I never knew anyone so changed. I live in constant terror of her. Do you know what happened only to-day?" "No, Annie, and what is more, I don't want to know. I am too full of my own affairs to be bothered by your minor troubles." "That is so like you, Rupert. I am afraid you are growing terribly selfish." "Now don't begin to preach, old girl. There, if it will make you any happier, you shall tell me your little adventure, whatever it was, only be quick about it." They walked round the square many times. Miserable as Annie felt, there was a strange glow at her heart. The colour had flamed into her pale cheeks and light into her red-brown eyes. She looked wonderfully handsome, and more than one person turned to gaze at her. She briefly told Rupert what had occurred at Mr. Parker's. "The old wretch!" cried Rupert. "If there is a man in the world whom I fairly loathe, it is Parker. And so he spoke of me as a scoundrel, did he? Perhaps I'll have my little revenge yet." "But you would not really do anything wrong, Rupert?" "Oh dear me, no," said Rupert in a sarcastic voice. "All I want at present is £20. Do let us drop Parker out of this conversation. If I could bleed him to that extent I would, right heartily. But as I do not see my way to doing so a second time, we must get it in some other fashion, and that remains for you to discover, Annie mine." "But, dear Rupert, there are no means open to me, and I would not, if I could, help you in that dreadful way again." "But you might think out another dodge. I laugh now when I think of how you managed before, forging a letter in another girl's name and taking it to Parker of all people, and Parker giving the money and blaming that bread-and-butter Miss Gilroy, and you and I getting off scot-free. It was about the cheekiest, boldest, cleverest deed that any girl ever did, and you did it for your brother's sake. Annie, my dear, you will be as clever, as cheeky, as bold again for your poor brother's sake." "Rupert, I cannot." "Then you know, of course, what the consequence will be." Rupert Colchester now completely changed his manner. He had an expressive face, capable of almost any emotion. He had been sad, he had been jocular, in Annie's presence during this short interview. Now he looked as if despair had seized him. His face changed colour, it lengthened, and seemed to grow thinner and more haggard each moment. "Then I cannot help it," he said. "I suppose there is nothing further to say. You did your best, and you can do no more. I'll be locked up. I have got into a scrape which I cannot explain to you. There is a fellow to whom I owe £20, and if I don't get it I'll be locked up. Think what you will feel when you have to go to the police court to give evidence against your brother." "But oh, Rupert, Rupert, how can you go in for such bad ways? Oh, if only mother were alive!" "Look here, Annie, none of that," said Colchester, his voice becoming so stern that poor Annie nearly shook. "There," he added, instantly changing his tone when he saw that she shivered and shrank from him. "I know you will help me if you can. You'll just think it over, and let me know when we next meet. Where did you say you were going to stay? At number 30? Who lives at number 30, Newbolt Square?" "People of the name of Aitchison." "But who are they?" "I don't know, Rupert." "They live in a respectable house, and must be well off," said Rupert. "I'll tell you what you'll do, Annie. You get Mrs. Aitchison to lend you £20. Now, see you do it, and be quick about it. She'll lend it fast enough if you pull a long face and make up a pitiable story, and I'll meet you somehow or other to-morrow. Oh yes, I'll manage. I need not enter into particulars just now. You will tell me what you can do when we meet. That is all I require for the present. If you get me that £20, I'll let you alone. I promise I will, for a month or two. But, Rupert, I don't know anything whatever about Mrs. Acheson. I have never seen her. Belle, her daughter, is a very odd, clever creature, but I am quite certain the Achesons are not rich." "Is this Belle one of the St. Wode's undergraduates?" "Yes." "Then of course they must be rich, or she could not go to a place like Wingfield. And that reminds me, Annie, what a goose you were not to take honours in your exam. You barely qualified, no more. If you had taken a first, I know a fellow who would have lent me £20 on the strength of your getting a good post. But now all that is knocked on the head, and by your laziness. Positively, it's enough to sicken a fellow. Well, Annie, you know what you have before you. You must get £20 for your brother within the next 2 or 3 days, or there is a prison ahead for him." "Oh, Rupert, Rupert, you do make me so perfectly wretched," said poor Annie. "I must frankly confess that I have no hope at all of being able to help you." "Where there's a will there's a way," said Rupert, whistling gaily. "Now I'm not going to bother you any more. My words will sink deep, I know, my pretty little Annie. Think of the old times. Do you remember that spring when we went out together and picked primroses, and that time when you had the measles, and I was so awfully good to you? Don't you remember when you were so tired of being left by yourself, I used to come in and risk taking the beastly thing a second time to amuse you? Oh, you'll help me. You won't leave your brother Rupert in a lurch. Well, go off now to your precious Achesons and your comfortable home. Think, when you are lapped in luxury, of your poor starving brother. Oh, Rupert, you surely are not starving?" "Well, I have not had a decent meal for a week. Last time I ate was yesterday evening, so you can imagine I'm pretty peckish. By the way, you don't happen to have a sovereign about you?" "No, indeed, I don't possess so much in the world. I've only got 14 shillings, not a penny more." Rupert gave vent to a prolonged whistle. "Are things really as bad as that?" he cried. "Well, at any rate, you won't want money while you're at the Achesons'. You might let me have those few shillings. You can have them back when you want them." "But, Rupert, they are all I possess, all I have between me and the workhouse." "Bother the workhouse! Much chance a pretty girl like you has of going there. Let me have 10 shillings at least. You surely do not mean to refuse your starving brother?" "Of course I cannot refuse you," said Annie. She took up her purse, opened it, and gave Rupert half a sovereign. "Ta-ta," he replied. "This will do until we meet to-morrow. You do look a bit dragged, Annie, now I come to examine you carefully, but better days will dawn." He shrugged his shoulders and walked down the street. Poor as he professed himself to be, he was by no means shabbily dressed. He had a fine figure, square shoulders, and a swagger in his walk. Annie gazed long after his retreating form. "Why is he about the most wicked person in the world, and why do I love him so much?" she thought. "There, I have only 4 shillings now. How am I to get that £20, heaven only knows. Oh, I am a miserable, most miserable girl." End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of the Girls of St. Wode's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pam Castile. The Girls of St. Wode's by L.T. Meade. Chapter 29. 30 Newbolt Square. Mrs. Acheson, although a most kind-hearted woman, an affectionate mother, would, if she had spoken her innermost thoughts, have confessed that Belle was not at all to her mind. Being her daughter, she thought it her duty to be as good as she could possibly be to Belle, but she would infinitely have preferred a girl in the style of Letty Chetwynd, a sociable, agreeable, pleasant girl, who would have done credit to pretty dresses, have won a desirable lover, and married comfortably. She would indeed have considered her cup of happiness complete had such a girl as Leslie Gilroy been hers. But Belle being the child allotted to her by Providence, she was wise enough to make the best of her, not to attempt to turn her into any other groove, and to endeavour to counteract her eccentricities as far as possible. When Belle mentioned to her mother that she had invited a St. Wode's girl to stay with her, Mrs. Acheson was pleased. She went happily upstairs to see that Annie's room was neat and comfortable, the bed well aired, and all the necessary accessories of a bedroom as they ought to be. When her young guest arrived, She hurried downstairs to welcome her, and seeing that the girl looked forlorn and tired, with a droop about her lips and an expression in her eyes which quite went to the good woman's heart, she kissed her affectionately, bade her welcome, and took her into the drawing-room. "You don't look well, dear," she said. "I am very pleased that Belle has asked you to stay with us. May I ask if you and my daughter are great friends?" "No," replied Annie. "In fact, we scarcely know each other. We did not live in the same house at St. Wode's, but we have met often. I happened to be at the Chetwynds this morning, where Leslie Gilroy was staying, when Miss Acheson arrived and most kindly invited me here for a week. I was only too glad to accept the invitation," continued Annie, raising her pathetic, half-starved eyes to Mrs. Acheson's face, "for I have no home at present." "Dear, dear, my poor child, that is truly sad," said the good lady. "But you must tell me all your story later on. I am deeply interested in young girls, and any friend of my Belle's has my kindest sympathy. Now let me take you to your room." Mrs. Acheson took Annie upstairs. She saw that the girl had hot water, said that Belle would be glad to lend her anything until her own truck arrived, and left her. "But I don't like the look on her face all the same," thought the good woman as she trotted downstairs. Belle was standing in the hall. "My dear," said Mrs. Acheson eagerly, "Miss Colchester has arrived." Belle did not immediately reply. She was hanging her jacket on the hat-stand. She seldom troubled to take it upstairs. "Yes, mother," she answered, putting her hand to her forehead and arranging her short locks into position. "But what about it? I thought naturally she would arrive." "She does not look very well, Belle. She seems so tired and, I scarcely like to say the word, so hungry." "Oh, I dare say she is," replied Belle in a careless tone. She was always a good bit of an oddity, and in the pursuit of knowledge doubtless neglected her food. "But as to her being ill, I think she is all right. She has worked rather hard, that is all." "Then we will give her a right good time, won't we, dear?" said Mrs. Acheson. Belle stared at her mother through her glasses, and again did not reply. She went into the drawing-room in her dusty boots. "As we have a guest to-night, Belle, dear, and—" "What in the world is it, mother? What are you fidgeting so dreadfully about?" "Nothing, my love, only would you greatly mind going upstairs to wash your hands, tidy your hair, and take off your dusty boots before dinner?" "Oh, dear," replied Belle in an impatient voice. "If I had thought Annie Colchester's being here would mean all this sort of thing, I would have thought twice before I invited her." It was now Mrs. Acheson's turn to make no reply. She knew Belle quite well enough to be certain that it was worse than useless to argue with her. If she left that eccentric young person to herself, things as a rule turned out according to Mrs. Acheson's wish. Belle hummed and hawed and looked very cross, but finally did leave the room. When dinner was announced, the two girls entered the dining-room together. Annie was only able to make a very scanty and imperfect toilet, for her clothes, which she had telegraphed to her late landlady to forward, had not yet arrived. They went down to dinner. The meal was a good one and nicely served. Annie ate heartily and felt considerably refreshed afterwards. She was tired, too. There was a sort of stunned feeling over her. If Mrs. Acheson only knew the truth, if she could guess even for a single moment that between Annie and starvation were only 4 shillings, would she not immediately think that she, Annie, had come into her house on false pretenses? People, as a rule, do not ask starving girls to partake of the comforts of their luxurious homes. There is the workhouse for such as them. Annie shivered. The idea of confiding in Mrs. Acheson never occurred to her. Meanwhile, that good and excellent woman had taken a fancy to the forlorn girl. She determined to give her a right good time, and to get at that secret which knitted her dark brows, and made her beautiful red-brown eyes so full of indescribable melancholy. Annie could not help cheering up after a little in the sunshine of this rare kindness. The little week which lay before her was an oasis in the desert. She would enjoy it while she could. She might gather some strength during these few days for the solitary and miserable time which lay before her, but, after all, her poverty was scarcely her worst trouble now. It was the thought of Rupert, the terrible and awful thought that he had once more been guilty, that he had broken his solemn word, that the police even now were at his heels. "What is to be done?" thought the wretched girl. "How am I to help him?" Presently Mrs. Acheson suggested that they should go to bed. "You can scarcely keep your eyes open," she said, looking at Annie. "Do go up to your room at once, dear, and have a long, good sleep." "Not quite yet, mother," said Belle, looking up from her book. "I want Annie Colchester to help me with this translation. I know she has gone right through the 6th book of Herodotus, and I have not. I want her to help me with the translation of the story which gave rise to the saying, 'What does Hippocleides care?'" Mrs. Acheson sighed and made no answer. A moment later she left the room. "You are not dead tired? You are willing to help me?" said Belle, looking at Annie when they found themselves alone. "I will help you, of course, Belle, if I can. I have read Herodotus and thought it splendid, but I do not know the story to which you allude." "Well, you can help me anyhow. Dear, dear, it does seem a pity that mother should have taken to you in this extraordinary manner. I know mother's ways so well. She will begin to fuss over you, and then you will imagine all sorts of things. But now, if you will take my advice, you won't consider yourself an ill-used martyr simply because mother has taken a fancy to you." "Oh, I have never thought myself a martyr," said Annie. "Then for goodness' sake don't wear that pensive air. I wish, too, you would not open your eyes so wide. It gives you a sort of starved look." "Starved? Really, Belle, I mean, Miss Acheson?" "You can call me Belle while you are here. It is shorter and more convenient. I could not possibly Miss Colchester you. The name is a great deal too long for everyday use. You shall be Anne or Anne while you are here. And now, pray, Anne, take this chair and let us get through our work." They did so. Annie soon became interested. She had considerable intellectual power, and between them the girls worked out the problem with regard to Hippocleides. Belle, the first to recognize genius when she saw it, clapped her hands with pleasure. "This is quite splendid," she said. "I never could get at the bottom of that stiff rendering before. I am delighted you are here. We can become the very closest friends. Some day, Annie, you shall come and live with me in my hostel. Mother does not yet know of my darling scheme. Poor mother herself must be excluded, and she will feel it, poor thing, but I shall have quite money enough of my own to pay the rent of the house for a couple of years after I leave college. Let me see. If you don't mind, I'll get the money box now and count my savings. I declare I am getting quite miserly over this matter." Belle went to the other end of the drawing-room, and from a desk, where her own special treasures were kept, took a square deal box. From her pocket she extracted a little key, fitted it into the box, and opened it. "Is it safe to leave so much money about in that careless way?" said Annie, who thought of her own 4 shillings, and quite shivered as Belle lifted out 3 canvas bags. "Safe? Of course it's safe," answered Belle. "Do you think our servants would touch my money? Besides, they do not know it is here. Even mother does not know what this box contains. She likes to dust the drawing-room herself, and a few days ago she lifted the box and said, 'Whatever is in here, Belle? It is so heavy.' I made no reply, and she said, 'I suppose, love, you are collecting coins.' I said, 'Yes, mother, I am collecting coins.' It was perfectly true, wasn't it? Clever of me, eh?" "Very clever," answered Annie, with the ghost of a smile. "Well, now, let us count. You shall help me by and by with my dear hostel. How happy we shall be! The world quite out of sight, we delving in the riches of the past. Oh, happy, happy maidens! We will eschew marriage. We will be nuns in the true sense of the word. How silent you are! Are you not glad?" "I cannot quite realize it," said Annie. "You will when you come to live with me. You will when you come to live with me. We won't need much furniture, will we, dear? Just the plainest rooms. Any spare cash we have will go for books, first editions, original manuscripts. Oh, lovely, lovely, bewitching, intoxicating! I see myself as I shall be during all the coming years, on to the decline of life, absorbing more and more knowledge, living above the world, in it but not of it." "But you won't be in it when you are in your hostel," said Annie, with a gleam of humor in her sad eyes. "You will be apart from it, and that is not according to Leslie Gilroy's ideas." "Dear, pretty Leslie," said Belle with sudden enthusiasm. "But the cares of the world have her in their grip. I admire her more than any worldly girl I have ever come across, but the world has her in its grip. Some day she will see her folly. I hope to convert her to my views in the long run." "That you never will," said Annie. "Think so? Well, I don't agree with you. Now, let us count." The canvas bags were opened, and they did count, or rather, Belle did. The money in the bags amounted to nearly £90. "How glad I am I did not buy that new summer dress," said Belle. "My old serge does capitally." She held out the dusty, fusty garment as she spoke. "That economy added £3 10 shillings to my hoard. See, I will write down the exact amount." She took a sheet of paper, scribbled the sum in rough writing, and thrust it into the box. £89 7 shillings and 10 pence, she said. "Even the pence are not to be despised. I shall be at St. Wode's until next June. During that time I hope to save, by the strictest economy, quite £50 more. We can then start our hostel almost immediately." "But what about food and furniture and all the rest of the things?" "Well, each girl, of course, must bring her own share. Wherever we are we must live." "Must we?" said Annie in a very pathetic voice. "Why, of course. It is absolutely essential that each human being should have his or her modicum of food. Now, don't let us talk of anything so very elemental. Let us consider the charming picture which lies before us, a charming little cottage in the country. We shall get it for £20 a year. The rest of the money will buy the furniture. There, Annie, you need not stay up any longer. You look as if you wished to sleep. Do sleep, enjoy it. Look like an ordinary mortal to-morrow, for if you don't, Mother will begin to take to you more than ever, and that will not suit my plans at all." Annie went to her room. She was so weary that she could not even think any longer. The box which held her few possessions had arrived. She took out her nightdress and soon afterward got into bed. She slept heavily all night, but toward morning she began to have confused and troubled dreams with regard to Belle's wooden box. She wished she had not been with Belle when she counted her money. The thought of that money became an obsession and a dreadful nightmare to her. At 7 o'clock the servant appeared with a daintily prepared tray containing tea. "Mrs. Acheson hopes you are quite rested, miss. She says if you are at all tired she would like you to stay in bed for breakfast." "Oh, no, I am quite refreshed. Tell her I thank her very much," said poor Annie. The girl bustled about the room preparing Annie's bath. She then left her to enjoy her tea. Annie sat up and stirred the cream into the fragrant cup. "How queer and dreamlike and wonderful all this is," she said to herself. "I enjoying tea at this hour in bed, and drinking it out of such delicate china, and oh, what a sweet little silver spoon! How pretty the room is, and everything belonging to it, and yet I possess only 4 shillings in the world. Mrs. Acheson is quite the sweetest woman I ever met. Oh, if my own mother had only lived, I should not be the miserable, hopeless creature I am to-day." At breakfast, Belle was in the best of spirits. She also had dreamed about her hostel, and the thought of the money she had saved was reflected in her face. After breakfast she proposed to Annie that they should spend the morning at the British Museum. "I can easily get you a day's ticket for the reading room," she said. "You shall sit near me, and we can have a good time." "But perhaps Annie would rather not go to the museum to-day," said Mrs. Acheson. "She looks very tired, as if she had been overdoing it." "I assure you, mother," said Belle, "that most of the St. Wode's students have that sort of look. There is nothing whatever in it. The rosy cheek, the bright eye which sparkles with no soul beneath, the pouting lips full of rude health, do not belong to the earnest student. Don't be alarmed about either of us, pray. We like our life, and we mean to cling to it." "Oh, I am not at all anxious about you, dear," said Mrs. Acheson. "You are always somewhat sallow, but you look well. Now, this poor child, how very thin she is!" Belle prepared to leave the room. "You will excuse me," she said, turning to Annie. "I have to get back to my work. Do you mean to come with me or not?" "I should like to come," said Annie. "Well, that is all right," said Belle, slightly mollified. "You meet me in the hall in half an hour." She dashed away, and Mrs. Acheson began to ask Annie some impossible questions with regard to her health. If I could but tell her the truth, thought the poor girl, if I could say, "Will you tell me how long 4 shillings, that means 48 pence, will keep any girl in food and raiment? I should be greatly obliged to you. If you can solve that problem, you would indeed be my greatest friend on earth. But no, no," thought Annie, "I cannot confide in her. That would be quite the worst of all." Presently Belle appeared, and the girls set off for the museum. On their way home, Belle went for a moment into a stationer's. "You need not come in," she said to Annie. "Just walk slowly on, and I'll soon overtake you." Annie had not gone a dozen yards before Rupert came up to her. "I just thought I would meet you on the road home," he said. "I have made up my mind. I shall call on you at Mrs. Acheson's this evening." "Oh, Rupert, surely you wouldn't dare!" "Dare?" said Rupert. "Why shouldn't I dare? You are to introduce me to the Achesons as your brother. As to that girl you are staying with, anyone can take her in. I shall be at 30 Newbolt Square between 8 and 9 tonight. Look out for me, and don't fail." He nodded and walked away. The next instant Belle came up. "I saw you talking to a man," said Belle. "Who was he? Do you know many men? Are you deceiving me, Annie Colchester?" "Deceiving you? What do you mean?" said Annie. "If you contemplate marriage, you had better tell me so at once." Notwithstanding all her misery, Annie could not help laughing. "The man I was speaking to is my brother," she said. "Your brother? I thought you were an orphan and alone." "I have one brother. His name is Rupert." "And that was he? Why in the world didn't you ask him to come home with us? I am sure mother would be delighted to see him." "He is coming to see me this evening," said Annie, her heart in her mouth. "Do you suppose that your mother will think that it is—" "Think what?" "That he is taking a liberty?" "Of course not. It is quite natural that a sister should like to talk to a brother, and mother will be full of sympathy. Yes, he is welcome, provided he does not come more than once. Give him to understand, please, Annie, that we have no time to waste in idle conversation with him. Yes, I will say it frankly. If there is a creature in the wide world I thoroughly despise, it is a man in his first adolescence." At lunch, Belle mentioned to her mother that Annie Colchester had a brother, and that he proposed to call that evening. "I shall give him a hearty welcome for your sake, my dear," said Mrs. Acheson. "What a pity I did not know, and I would have asked him to share our dinner." "It is very kind of you to see him at all," said Annie, who felt more wretched each moment. If Mrs. Acheson really knew the sort of man she was receiving into her house, would she ever forgive Annie? End of chapter 29. Recording by Pam Castile. Chapter 30 of The Girls of St. Wode's. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pam Castile. The Girls of St. Wode's by L.T. Meade. Chapter 30. Annie in the Toils. At 7 the Achesons dined. Soon after 8 o'clock there came a ring to the front door, and Rupert Colchester was announced. He came in looking brisk, smart, and handsome. He had managed, Annie could not imagine how, to get himself up well. He wore a frock coat of the newest cut. His tie was immaculate, so were his collar and cuffs. He had a hem-stitched handkerchief in his pocket with a slight scent about it. His hair had been cut, his face was clean-shaven. He was so good-looking that poor foolish Annie felt a glow at her heart when she saw him enter the room. Mrs. Acheson was kind to Annie's brother, and Annie's brother managed to make himself extremely agreeable. He talked to Mrs. Acheson, but he looked at Belle. Now, Belle, although she declared that there was no one in the world she despised like a man in his first adolescence, was disturbed by these glances from Rupert's dark eyes. She pretended not to remark them; nevertheless, she found her own short-sighted orbs meeting his again and again. After the fourth or fifth meeting of the two pairs of eyes, Rupert got up, left his seat by Mrs. Acheson, and came over to where Belle sat. "Do you know," he said, dropping into a chair by her side, "that you interest me immensely?" "Indeed," answered Belle, "I am rather surprised to hear you say so. I never yet knew the man who wanted to look at me a second time. I know I am extremely plain, and the fact is I glory in being so." "It is my turn now to be surprised," said Rupert very gently. "Good looks are a great gift. You are quite mistaken in considering yourself plain. However, it is not your coloring, nor the size of your mouth, nor the shape of your face which specially strikes me. It is the remarkable development of your forehead. I spent several of my early years in America, and I remember when there meeting a man with a forehead like yours. He was the greatest classical scholar at Harvard College near Boston." Belle could not help blushing with intense gratification. "Ah," she said, "I also have the same taste. I passionately love the classics." Rupert dropped his voice. He began to talk to Belle at once about Cicero, Socrates, Homer, and her other favorite writers of antiquity. Soon they were in the full flow of a most animated conversation. Belle spoke eagerly and well. She unfolded the riches of her really great knowledge, and Rupert cleverly led her on. He had a smattering of Greek and Latin at his fingers' ends, but no more. He managed, however, to use his very little knowledge to the best advantage, and Belle was so flattered by his covert glances, by his skilfully veiled compliments, by his pretended comprehension of her and her moods, that she never guessed how shallow were his acquirements, and opened out herself more and more. If Annie was nice, her brother was even nicer. He was the exception that proves the rule. After all, there always was an exception, always, always. A faint color came into her thin cheeks. Coffee was brought in, very fragrant, strong coffee. A servant approached Belle with a tray, but she waved it aside. "Not now," she said. Then she turned to Rupert. "Why will mother always insist upon spoiling a great intellectual treat with those tiresome attentions to creature comforts? Who wants coffee at a moment like this?" Now Rupert, who had not been able to indulge in a good dinner, would have liked a cup of fragrant coffee immensely, but he instantly took his cue from Belle and declined it with a wave of the hand. "None for me," he said. "Yes, Miss Acheson, I agree with you. At a moment like the present one cannot think of sublunary matters." "Do go on," said Belle. "So you really studied—" And then once more the conversation assumed its classical complexion. Annie, looking on from afar, felt more and more dreadful each moment. Rupert was undoubtedly trying to be agreeable to Belle for a purpose. Annie knew her brother quite sufficiently well to be certain that Belle's manners, her attachment to the classics, her whole style, would be the very last that Rupert, in easier moments of his career, would have deigned to notice. At last, soon after 10 o'clock, he took his leave. In the meantime he had learned not only all that Belle could tell him of her own college life, but also the darling hope of the future. The little wooden box which contained the 89 pounds odd was pointed out to Rupert. He nodded to Annie as he left the room. She followed him into the hall. "Well, how did I get on?" he inquired. "I don't understand you," answered Annie. "You frighten me dreadfully." "What a little goose you are! Well, I'm coming again. I shall come tomorrow or next day. Be sure you follow up the impression I have made with the fair Belle." Then he made a grimace, kissed Annie lightly on her forehead, and left the house. She went to bed feeling intensely uncomfortable. By the first post in the morning she received a letter. It was from Rupert, and ran as follows: "My dear Annie, for the desperate, only desperate devices, I am desperate. I have made up my mind. The fair and delightful Miss Belle shall be my deliverer. I want you and she to meet me in the broad walk in Regent's Park between 4 and 5 this afternoon. I mean boldly to secure 40 pounds out of her wooden box. She herself shall give it to me. While I am talking to her, you must be engaged in another way. Excellent! Get the good mamma to come too. You and the mamma can walk behind, the fascinating Belle and I in front. I foretell that I can twist my fair Belle round my little finger. Help me now, Annie, as you value your brother's future. You perceive how nobly I take the matter out of your hands. Miss Belle Acheson has her sphere in life, but it is not what she thinks. It is not to open a hostel for idiotic women who think themselves learned, but to help Rupert Colchester in his hour of need. Your affectionate brother. Annie read this letter twice. At each perusal her sense of dismay grew greater. The worst of it was, too, that Rupert had given no address. She could not write in reply, or send him a telegram, or do anything to stop him. He would walk in the broad walk in Regent's Park that afternoon, and if Annie and Belle did not appear would go boldly to the house in Newbolt Square. Annie felt that she herself was a guest in that house more or less on false pretenses. But that Rupert should take advantage of Mrs. Acheson's hospitality was more than the poor girl could stand. "I must have it out with him," she said to herself, "but Belle shall not come with me. I must go and brave him alone. Oh, I know what he will say and what torture I shall have to endure, for, great sins as he has committed, I still love him. No, I will be brave now. I won't sin again for him. But God help me, I do not know how to bear all this awful burden." The poor girl looked so miserable at breakfast that Mrs. Acheson remarked it. "My dear child," she said, "do you know that your appearance quite concerns me? I am certain you are not well. I am also sure that you are troubled about something. Have you no relations, dear, except that extremely nice-looking brother of yours?" "I have no relations at all," replied Annie, "except Rupert. My father and mother lived in America, where they died. I was quite a child when I came to England. Since then Rupert and I have been practically alone. We were brought up during the early years of our life by a guardian, who has since died." "Well, at any rate, I congratulate you on your brother, Annie," said Belle from the far end of the room, where she was reading Socrates. "He has what I call a pure taste for the classics. I shall be very pleased indeed to see him here again. Mother, don't you agree with me that Mr. Rupert Colchester is a scholarly and gentlemanly man?" "Yes, dear Belle, I do," said Mrs. Acheson. "Now, I tell you what it is," she said, turning in a confidential way to Annie. "You and your brother shall see as much of each other as possible while you are with me. If you will just give me his address, I will send him a line asking him to dine with us this evening. He feels leaving you so much." "Leaving me?" said Annie. "Did he say anything about that?" "Yes, my dear. When he goes to India, he says you will feel the parting terribly. He has secured an excellent post in the civil service, and has to start in about a fortnight. Why, what is the matter, dear Annie?" For Annie's eyes had dropped onto her plate, and her face looked like death. "I did not know that Rupert was going to India," she said at last, raising them desperately and fixing them on Mrs. Acheson. "Perhaps he did not like to tell you, my love. From the way he spoke, I rather judged that he had only just got his appointment. Of course, you must know in the end. He feels so very full of sympathy for you, Annie." Annie got up. She made an excuse to leave the room. She felt that she could not contain herself another moment. "Give me his address, dear, before you go," said Mrs. Acheson. "I think it might be best for me to send him a telegram. Where is he staying?" Annie turned, stood bolt upright, and uttered, as if she was charging the words out of a cannon, "I don't know." "You don't know where your brother is staying? That does seem strange. But has he no permanent address?" "Dear me, mother," said Belle from the other end of the room. "Does that matter? A man with Mr. Colchester's extensive taste doubtless cares little where he lays his head at night. He is, I presume, at one of the hotels. There are many hotels in London. Have you not discovered that yet?" "I never thought of the hotels," said Mrs. Acheson in an apologetic voice. "He did not happen to tell you which one he was staying at, my love?" "No," said Annie, "he did not." "That is a pity." "But," continued the young girl, "I can give him your invitation. It is very kind of you to ask him. I had a letter from him this morning asking me to meet him in Regent's Park." "Dear, dear," said Mrs. Acheson, "of course he wants to tell you this news about India." "Certainly, my love, you shall go. It will be quite convenient. And now, What do you say to having a nice drive? I think a little fresh air would do you good. Belle, suppose you go for a drive with Annie. I will send round to Marchand's for a landau. You might take her to Richmond." "Really, mother," answered Belle in a tart and injured voice, "do you suppose I have time for such frivolity? For a drive with no object whatever except to inhale the air? Do you not understand that all my life is mapped out, that each moment is lived by rule? This morning I intend to make a careful study of my Greek grammar, as it is my intention to write an extensive essay on the characteristics of the Aeolic dialect, with illustrations from literature." Mrs. Acheson sighed and rose hastily. "You must do as you please, Belle, of course," she said. "Certainly, dear mother, I intend to. If Annie likes, she can stay and help me, for she has quite a good taste in Greek, and a nice accent. But if, on the other hand, she prefers the utter inanity of a drive, why, surely you can go with her?" "So I will," said Mrs. Acheson, "and I believe that Annie and I will enjoy the inanity, as you call it, immensely. Annie, we will go to Richmond." "So be it," said Belle. "I do not expect to see either of you until this evening. I am off at once to my study. The Greek dialects, classified as Ionian and non-Ionian, are full of the deepest interest." She fled from the room in a sort of whirlwind, slamming the door after her. Mrs. Acheson looked at Annie. "Belle is a dear, good creature," she said, in a half-hesitating way, "but still it seems a pity." "What?" asked Annie. "That she should be quite so devoted to the dead languages. Surely things of living moment are much more important." "Well, I happen to be very fond of the classics myself," answered Annie, "so I ought not to blame Belle. But she does go to the fair with the thing, does she not?" "It seems so to me, dear, but then I am, comparatively speaking, an ignorant woman. We women of the last generation had not the advantages which you young creatures now receive. What Belle means by the Ionian and non-Ionian dialects I am absolutely ignorant about." "It does not matter," said Annie gently. "I agree with you, my love. It scarcely matters much, but your pale cheeks and that anxious expression in your eyes matter a great deal. If I can be of any use to you, Annie, understand that I shall be only too pleased." "Do you mean it?" said Annie. She went up to Mrs. Acheson. The widow held out her hand, which Annie clasped. "Do you really mean it?" continued Annie. "I do, my dear child. I wish you would tell me what really troubles you." "I long to confide everything to you," replied Annie, "but I dare not. Please don't ask me. Let me be happy while I am here, and don't be too kind." "What does the poor child mean?" thought Mrs. Acheson. She now laid her hand on Annie's shoulder, drew her to her side, and kissed her tenderly on her forehead. "I am drawn to you because you are a motherless girl," she said, "and whenever you feel that you can give me your confidence, I shall be only too happy to receive it, and also, Annie, my dear, to respect it. I am an old woman, and have seen much of life. Perhaps I could counsel you if you are in any difficulty." "No, no, it may not be," said Annie in a whisper which nearly choked her. "Very well, we will say no more at present. I am going now to give directions about the carriage." At 11 o'clock an open landau was at the door, and Mrs. Acheson and Annie went for their drive. It was a lovely summer's day, and Regent's Park looked its best. Long years afterward Annie Colchester remembered that drive. The delightful motion of the easy carriage in which she was seated, the soft breezes on her cheeks, Mrs. Acheson's kind and intelligent conversation returned to her memory again and again. Oh, why was life so different for her to what it was for other girls? Oh, that she could confide in Mrs. Acheson! But then the knowledge that this good woman pitied her because she imagined that she was suffering from a girlish depression or some other equally unimportant contretemps caused her heart to rise with wild rebellion in her breast. If I could tell her the truth, would not her ears tingle and her heart beat? Thought Annie to herself. Good as she is not the person to help me in a great calamity of this sort. In her quiet, sheltered, prosperous life, what can she know of sorrows like mine? Oh, Rupert, why were you and I left alone in the world, and why did you turn out bad, and why do I love you so much? The drive was over, and the time arrived when Annie was to set off to meet Rupert in Regent's Park. She arrived at the rendezvous a minute or two late, and he was already waiting for her. He still wore the immaculate frock coat, and looked quite the handsome, smart young man of the world. But when he saw Annie coming to meet him alone, a heavy frown completely altered his expression. His lips took a sarcastic and even malignant curve. He went up to his sister and shook her by the shoulder. "Now, what is the meaning of this?" he said. But Rupert's very insolence made Annie brave. "It means," she replied, "that I do not intend to do what you ask." "You don't? You're a nice girl to help a fellow." "I have made up my mind," continued Annie. "I won't ever do anything wrong to help you again." "Oh, you won't you? Then listen, heartless girl. Don't you know that I have you completely in my power? If I were to tell what you did at Wingfield, you could be arrested on a charge of forgery. There is an ugly punishment accorded by the law to such proceedings." "You cannot frighten me, Rupert," said Annie, much to the astonishment of that gentleman, "for I have thought the whole thing carefully over. It would be quite impossible for me to be punished, and for you to go scot-free. So, for your own safety, you will keep what you know in the dark. Now, the thing for you to consider is that I do not intend to help you to get any money from my friends, the Achesons." Rupert was so much astonished at Annie's tone that for a moment he did not reply. Then, all of a sudden, he changed his tactics. He ceased to be furious and became, in the poor girl's opinion, far more dangerous. He drew her hand through his arm and invited her to walk with him. He then proceeded to sketch a most vivid and graphic picture of his own sufferings, the extreme danger in which he stood, and the awful disgrace which would fall upon Annie's devoted head when the law of the land took its course upon him. But Annie, for some reason which she did not quite understand herself, felt strangely strong that afternoon. Perhaps it was Mrs. Acheson's kindness. Perhaps it was the thought of Leslie, and what Leslie endured through Annie's former ill-doing. Even Belle, with all her eccentricities, had a perceptible influence upon Annie now. For all these good, these dear people, look upon crime as an impossibility, thought the girl. Now Rupert seems to take it as the ordinary course of existence. There is no saying. I may get to look at things from his standpoint if I don't take care. I dare not. I will never yield to his entreaties. So though he begged of her, and implored of her, and bullied her, and flattered her, though he used all his eloquence, Annie remained firm. It was the first time in all Rupert's experience that he found her so, and it was the first time he thoroughly respected his sister. At the end of that interview he saw that if he was to get anything out of the Achesons, he must do it in his own way. "You have astonished and pained me," he said at last. "I never thought you would desert me. Even in my darkest hour I have always thought, well, at least there is Annie. Now my hour of gloom has truly arrived, my black hour come, and I am only able to say, Annie has deserted me." "No," answered Annie, "I have not really deserted you, but I will not consent to drag either you or myself any lower. I dragged you low enough when I gave you that last money. I have lowered myself. I shall never be the same again. I have also injured one of the best girls in the world. I bitterly repent of the sin which I committed. I am truly sorry for poor Leslie. Now, Rupert, you know my decision." "Yes, it is true what I have just said. You have utterly forsaken me." "No, for I still love you." "Oh, don't talk humbug, Annie," said Rupert with an angry interjection. "When you utter the word love at such a moment like the present, you make me actually sick." "I will not utter it again," said Annie, "but I can still feel it, Rupert. I will not do wrong for you. On that point I am firm. Now I must leave you. Oh, by the way, Mrs. Acheson gave me a message for you. She wished to know if you would dine with them this evening. Of course you will not come. Under the circumstances it would be quite impossible, but you may as well send back a polite message." "Say, with my compliments, that I shall be heartily pleased to accept the invitation," answered Rupert. "How can you dare?" "Will you give the message? May I not accept my own invitation, or am I to be beholden to you?" "Well, come if you like," said poor Annie. I cannot quarrel with you nor argue with you any longer. Come if you wish to do so, but plainly understand that if you attempt to ask Belle Acheson to lend you any money, I shall immediately tell the entire truth to Mrs. Acheson. I believe you. You are turning into a perfect little fiend. Well, at any rate, expect me at dinner time. End of chapter 30. Recording by Pam Castile.
Chapter 31 of The Girls of St. Wode's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Claire. The Girls of St. Wode's by L. T. Meade. Chapter 31. Handwriting. After Annie and Leslie had left him, Mr. Parker returned to his office. There were 2 or 3 candidates still waiting for the vacant post of secretary. One of his clerks came to inquire what was to be done with them. "I cannot see them," was the reply. "You may as well say that the matter is practically settled, and that there is no use in any of them waiting." The clerk withdrew, and Mr. Parker began to pace up and down the length of his room. "Well, bless my soul," he said, "I cannot make out what all this means. There is a mystery somewhere. Why won't Leslie Gilroy confess the truth? Well, if I don't get to the bottom of this thing, my name's not Charles Parker. I believe, yes, I cannot help believing, that somehow the girl is innocent, but appearances are much against her." He opened a certain drawer in a cabinet which stood against his desk, took from it a letter, and began to read. The letter ran as follows: "Dear Mr. Parker, I am in great trouble and perplexity. I have got into a terrible scrape here, and only you can get me out again. I dare not confide in Mother. You alone can help me. Will you give my friend Annie Colchester £60 for me, and will you give it in notes and gold? I will never do what I have done again, if only you will trust and forgive me this time. I cannot imagine how I have been led into these terrible debts, but I can only say I will never incur another. Please give the money to Annie at once, for the matter is most urgent. Your affectionate friend, Leslie Gilroy." "There," said the good merchant to himself, "there is her own letter, her own statement in black and white. She got into a scrape, went in debt, and wanted me to give her money. Well, if it were only debt, the ordinary girlish wish to possess herself of fallals and finery. Well, if it were only debt, the ordinary girlish wish to possess herself of fallals and finery, why, I could forgive the child. There's a look on her face which makes it hard for any man to withstand her. But the thing is this, she has not made a full statement. She did not want money for ordinary debts. She had another reason, and she would not divulge it. Why did she write to me as she did? What can be up? 'Pon my word, I feel quite frightened. There's that mother of hers, the best of good women, and that noble young fellow her brother, and the rest of them. Plenty of character, plenty of go, plenty of spirit, nothing mean or underhand about one of them. And there's Leslie, whom all the rest look up to as the straightest of the straight and the best of the best, and who has about the most open face I ever looked into. And yet, if this letter is true, she is a sly, cunning little rogue, as sly and cunning as can be. I pity the mother, that I do. But there, is the girl guilty? Isn't there some explanation of this extraordinary mystery?" Mr. Parker looked again at the letter, then he folded it up and was about to put it back into his cabinet when he saw the paper on which Leslie had scribbled her request to him that day, lying on the floor. He stooped and picked it up, and the next moment his red face had turned pale, for Leslie's scribble, carelessly written as it was, seemed to him to be written in a decidedly different hand from that of the letter. A moment later, all eagerness, quite trembling with excitement, the shrewd man of business was comparing both writings. There was a strong resemblance. Most of the capitals were formed in the same way, but there was also a distinct difference. With pursed-up lips and a wise shake of his head, Mr. Parker slipped the letter and the scrap of paper into his pocket and left the office. On his way out he spoke to his head clerk. "Hudson, don't expect me back to-day. I shall return at my usual hour to-morrow." "Something has happened to annoy the chief very considerably," thought the clerk to himself, as Mr. Parker's back disappeared through the doorway. A moment later the great tea merchant found himself in the street. The next he had hailed a hansom, and given the address of Mrs. Gilroy's house in West Kensington. "I could go by train, but a hansom will take me quicker," he muttered to himself. "I hope to goodness she won't be in. It's Llewellyn I wish to have a chat with. Yes, I must investigate this matter, and I don't want the mother to know anything about it until I can feel my bearings. There's a way out of this somehow, and I believe the poor girl is nothing but a dupe. Can it be possible that she is shielding someone? But no, that can't be the case, for when I went down to Wingfield she knew all about the story and never denied for a moment that she had written the letter. She looks sorry enough, but not surprised. No, not surprised. Bless me, if I know what the whole thing means. These girls with their modern education know a thing too much when they're a match for a shrewd old fellow like myself. But I'll see Llewellyn. I'll sound him, whatever happens." When Mr. Parker got to the Gilroys' house, it so happened that Llewellyn himself was going up the steps. He was just about to put his latch-key into the door when the merchant's hearty voice arrested him. Llewellyn turned round, and a smile broke over his face. "But mother's out, I'm afraid, Mr. Parker. You'll come in all the same, though, won't you?" "Yes, Llewellyn, my man, I just will. I want to have a word with you, my boy." "Certainly, sir. Is there anything I can do?" "Take me where we can be alone for a minute or two. Your sister isn't in, eh?" "You mean Leslie?" "Yes, your eldest sister, Leslie." "No, Mr. Parker, she is with her friends, the Chetwynds. One of the girls is very ill, and the other won't do without Leslie." "I'm not specially surprised at that," said the merchant. "She seems the sort of girl one would rely on a good bit, but that is not what I have come about. See here, Llewellyn, have you got a letter of your sister's handy?" "A letter? What do you mean?" said Llewellyn. "Just what I say. I want to see one of your sister's letters." "But I don't understand," said Llewellyn. "And I don't want you to understand, my boy. I want you just to exercise a little bit of faith in your father's old friend, and not say a single word to your mother about this. Now go and find some letters of your sister's. When you have found them, I want you to put a couple of them into my care. If they contain any secrets, you may trust me not to blab, but this is a serious matter, and there is more in it than meets the eye. There, my boy, just do what you are told." "Of course, I have got several of Leslie's letters," answered Llewellyn. "I think there are a few which do not contain anything of a private nature. I will give you one or two, sir, with pleasure." Llewellyn left the room, returning presently with a packet of letters kept together with an elastic band. "There," he said, "you can have them all, sir. I have not even looked at them. Leslie is as open as the day, and there is nothing in her letters that you may not see." "As open as the day, eh? You really think so? She's not a bit secretive, now?" "Secretive? My sister?" asked Llewellyn, drawing himself up and flushing angrily. "There, don't get peppery. I'm very much obliged to you. You shall have these letters back again in a day or two at the farthest." "But you are going, Mr. Parker?" "Yes, I must hurry back to town as fast as ever I can. Now, good-bye to you. But hark, Llewellyn, not a word of this to your mother." "Certainly not, if you do not wish it, sir. But I fail to understand." "You must have faith, my boy. You will know all sooner or later." With the letters in his pocket, Mr. Parker went straight off to Scotland Yard. There he had an interview with Chief Inspector Jones, got the address of a special expert of handwriting, and drove off to the man's house. Mr. Essex was in, and Mr. Parker had a short, emphatic interview with him. "Well, sir," he said finally, "you quite understand. You will examine the letters, and let me know the result to-morrow morning." Mr. Essex promised, and the merchant went away. "Now," he said to himself, "if this is a little game which some good people are trying to hide from Charles Parker, they will quickly find themselves in the wrong box." End of chapter 31. Recording by Claire.
Chapter 32 of The Girls of St. Wode's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Girls of St. Wode's by L. T. Meade. Chapter 32. Who has taken the key? Punctual to the hour, and in a suitable evening dress, Rupert Colchester appeared at the Achesons' house. Mrs. Acheson received him with her usual kindness. She was alone in the room when the young man happened to put in an appearance. "Do you know," she said, "that I am quite glad to have an opportunity of seeing you by yourself. I am not at all happy about your sister." "Indeed," replied Rupert, putting on a sympathetic and very interested air. "Be sure of this, that anything you may happen to say to me about Annie will have my most tender consideration and my deepest interest. Annie and I are practically alone in the world. What is wrong with the dear girl?" "She is very far from well that I can see," replied Mrs. Acheson. "She is also very much depressed, unnaturally so. And do you know, Mr. Colchester, that she did not know anything about your appointment in the civil service? She was amazed when I told her you were going to India." "Ah," said Rupert, thoughtfully tapping the back of his heel against the brass rail of the fireplace. "I felt sure she would feel it dreadfully. The fact is, up to the present, I have not dared to break the news to her. She is so intensely affectionate. Of course I intended to do so to-night. Now that you have done so, it is a great relief to me. She will not feel it so dreadfully after a little, and I know I can buoy her up with hope, for my intention is that she shall join me in a year or two. She shall be my housekeeper until she enters a good home of her own. I could not think of marrying until my dear Annie had a home of her own." "I feel certain that you had a good motive in keeping the important news back from her," replied innocent Mrs. Acheson, "and I respect you all the more for your consideration." Just at that instant Belle and Annie entered the room. Belle wore her best dress. It was not much to look at, but something very great and uncommon must have induced her to put it on. It was made of soft black silk, and had ruffles of lace round the neck and wrists. She wore also a very narrow gold chain round her neck. When Rupert spoke to her, Belle found herself blushing. Dinner was announced. Mrs. Acheson asked him to take her daughter down, and she herself conducted Annie to the dining room. Annie had made no attempt to improve her appearance. She sat feeling shy and uncomfortable, scarcely opening her lips, while Rupert carried the conversation his own way. He was a clever man, and he contrived on the present occasion to make himself quite brilliant. He talked about India, spoke of the liner in which he was going out, turned aside to Annie to say, "I will explain everything to you, my dear, presently," told good stories about his early life in America, and then about his education in London, and managed to delight both Mrs. Acheson and Belle by the peep he gave them into a world which they had never entered. His manners to Belle were all that could be desired. He was extremely courteous and deferential, and managed to convey a touch of admiration which was never unduly obtrusive. Such a strong effect did he have upon her that she forgot her beloved classics as she listened to him. The meal came to an end, and when the ladies rose, Rupert accompanied them to the drawing-room. "No wine for me, thanks," he said. "I am practically a teetotaler." He then drew a chair near Belle's side, and contrived to draw her into a literary conversation of deep interest. Annie felt on thorns as she watched the two. More firmly each moment was she making up her mind. If Rupert dared to ask Belle to lend him any of the money in the wooden box, she would confess all. She felt herself a hypocrite, and could scarcely stand Mrs. Acheson's kind and affectionate remarks. At last the slow evening came to an end. By this time Rupert had perambulated almost every foot of the drawing-room. He had stood close to the box. Once his hands had touched it. It was when he was looking at Belle's precious Greek Testament, which lay on top of it. Rupert quoted a few sentences out of the Testament in his melodious voice to Belle, who nodded and praised his accent. He then went and stood in the deep embrasure of the window, looking out at the moon, which threw its radiance over the garden outside, and all of a sudden, without the least warning, began to talk of burglars. "This is a very nice house," he said, "but with that garden at the back it is not too safe, and you have no men on the premises, have you?" "No," said Belle, "but I don't understand what you mean." "Well, I have the greatest dread of burglars breaking into a house inhabited only by women." "Oh, we are not at all afraid," replied Belle. "Who would burgle here? We have no special valuables, a very little silver, no more. Besides, the windows are all thoroughly secured." She showed the device of the latch to Rupert, who said it was clever, very ingenious indeed. A moment or two afterwards he took his leave. As he did so he nodded to Annie. "See you to-morrow, little sis," he said. "Cheer up about India, old girl. You shall come and join me by and by. Good-bye, Mrs. Acheson. I cannot tell you how I have enjoyed my evening." To Belle he did not say a word about his special enjoyment, but he gave her a look full of eloquence. She found herself blushing, and her heart beat a trifle quicker than its wont. When the hall door closed behind him, both ladies were eloquent in his praise. "A charming fellow, and what a nice expression," said Mrs. Acheson. "He is clever, which is better than being a charming man," said Belle. "He has a great and sincere respect for all learning. In his way he is an enthusiast. I do not care for conversation with men as a rule, but I must own that I respect Mr. Colchester, and enjoy talking to him. He is so sincere and so straightforward." "May I go to bed?" said Annie suddenly. "I have a bad headache, and should like to lie down." "Oh, poor child," said Mrs. Acheson. "I do hope you are not sickening for anything, dear. You have looked so ill since you have been with us. Will you have some sal volatile or eau de cologne? What do you take when you have bad headaches?" "Nothing," answered Annie. "I lie down and try to sleep." She hurried from the room, scarcely waiting to bid either lady good night. Mrs. Acheson and Belle sat up a little longer, then they also retired for the night. Annie had lain down on her bed without undressing. It is true she pulled the counterpane over her in case Mrs. Acheson or Belle should come into the room, but sleep was far from her wakeful eyes. By and by the house grew quiet. She heard the servants going up to their attics overhead. She heard Mrs. Acheson shut herself into her own room, and Belle shut herself into hers. Belle slept with her door locked, and Annie heard the key being turned. A few moments later profound silence fell upon the house. The lights were all out. One by one the inhabitants slept, all but Annie, who lay with every nerve tingling and her sense of waiting preternaturally acute. While Rupert had been in the house she had followed all his movements with a terrible knowledge of him and his ways which gave her the clue to much that he was doing. When he laid his hand on the wooden box, Annie felt as if a burning red hand had touched her own heart. When he stood by the window she could scarcely contain her uneasiness. When he spoke about burglars, it seemed to her that the whole of what was immediately to follow was laid bare to her. Rupert was in desperate straits. He would stop at nothing to achieve his object. Was it possible that he, the man whom Annie loved, whose father had been good and respectable, whose mother had been one of the gentlest and sweetest of women, would stoop as low as this? Alas, Annie feared it. Now was her time for action. She slipped softly out of bed, unfastened her door without making any noise, and glided down through the silent house. Mrs. and Miss Acheson were both sound sleepers. The servants were far away. She reached the ground floor, turned the handle of the drawing-room door, found the door locked from the outside. Taking great care she unlocked it, still without making any sound. Then in her stocking feet she crossed the room and took her place in shadow close to the window where Rupert had stood that evening. The moon was still up, and its light fell across the room. The drawing-room had 3 large windows with Venetian blinds. It looked on to a fair-sized garden. The windows were not more than 3 feet from the ground. Annie now observed with increased apprehension that the blind to this window was up. She instantly remembered that it had got out of order that morning, and heard Mrs. Acheson say that she must send for a man to repair it. Rupert must have also noticed that fact as he stood with Belle close to the window. Annie got still deeper into the shadow of the thick curtains and waited. All too soon she heard just what she expected to hear. Steps in the garden outside. The steps approached the window. The bright flood of moonlight was broken by a huge shadow. A man was standing on the window-sill. Annie did not stir. She heard the grating noise of a small diamond against the glass. A square was quickly cut out. A hand and arm intruded themselves, and the hasp, the construction of which had been explained to Rupert by Belle, was quickly unfastened. The next instant the window was lifted, and Rupert Colchester stepped into the room. He went at once to the table where the wooden box stood, laid his hand on it, and was about to turn back when Annie, making a sudden movement, confronted him, standing in the white light caused by the moon. "You must put that box back, Rupert," said Annie. "If you don't I shall call out." Her sudden and unlooked-for appearance and her brave words staggered the man. He was holding the box in his hand. He dropped it now in his agitation. Before he could stoop to pick it up, Annie had snatched at it, flown across the room and put it out into the hall. She then locked the drawing-room door and slipped the key in her pocket. "Now, Rupert," she said, coming back to him, "the window is open and you can go. I know you won't injure me. After all, however wicked you are, I am your own sister, and the only person in all the world who loves you. You can go, Rupert, you can escape, the way is clear, but steal that box you don't. I would rather die than let you." By this time the astonished and discomfited man had found his voice. "I have not come here to be betrayed by you," he said. "I am desperate, so you had best leave me alone." Give me the key of the door this minute. If you don't, I shall take it by force. Rupert, I hear someone stirring overhead. Mrs. Acheson has heard you already. Oh, go for heaven's sake. A nice position you'll be in, he said with a sneer. The noise in the room was more audible than ever. Someone was heard walking across it. You've done for me, he cried. A nice sister you are. Yes, I suppose I had best hook it. Steps were now heard coming downstairs. Rupert, scowling at Annie, made a rush to the window, put his foot over the ledge and disappeared. He had scarcely done so before Mrs. Acheson's voice was heard calling at the other side of the locked door. "Is anybody in this room?" she cried. "Who has taken the key? What is wrong?" Annie thought for a moment. She then walked straight to the door and flung it open. "How you frightened me," said Mrs. Acheson, coming in. "My dear child, what is the matter? How terrible you look! What is wrong?" "I have had a fright," replied Annie. "There's been an attempt at burglary." She shook all over. "Don't question me now, for I cannot bear it," she said. "It is safe he has not taken it. Do you see the square cut out of the pane of glass? He came in that way. He was just about to take the box when I showed myself." "The box, child? What box?" "Belle's wooden box." "What, that wooden box that Belle keeps full of coins?" "Yes, the same. I saved it. It is in the hall. I feel a little faint." "Poor child, no wonder. What a terrible scare you have had. Who would have supposed that burglars would come to us? Well, dear, if the box had been stolen, how disappointed they would have been to find only ordinary coins. But come upstairs, Annie. I must get you some sal volatile at once." Mrs. Acheson dragged Annie upstairs, then went to the servants, awoke them, and sent 2 of them off immediately to the nearest police station. She questioned Annie still further with regard to the burglary, but could get little or nothing out of her, and concluded that she was stunned by the sudden shock. It was not until the widow had gone back to her room that she remembered how very strange it was that Annie should have locked the drawing-room door. How still stranger it was for Annie to be in the drawing-room at all. She was not naturally suspicious, but these circumstances did cause her a little serious thought. When the morning dawned, she went to her daughter's bedroom. Belle had heard nothing of the adventures of the previous night, and was considerably annoyed when her mother rattled the handle of the locked door and asked for admission. Belle opened the door, and then stood somewhat crossly waiting for Mrs. Acheson to speak. "What is the matter?" she asked. The widow related what had occurred, said that she had found Annie in the drawing-room with the door locked, and Belle's wooden box of coins at the other side. "My coins? My treasures?" said Belle, colour and animation rushing into her face. "How brave of dear Annie! How splendid of her! I know why she did it. It is unnecessary to explain the matter to you just at present, mother. I can only say that the box was full of valuables, and dear brave little Annie has rescued them. Oh, she and I must indeed be one after this, all during the remainder of our lives. How queer, mother! It was only last night Mr. Colchester said something about burglars. He seemed to think we were in danger, with the drawing-room window so close to the ground and looking into the garden, but I explained to him the ingenious way in which the windows were fastened, and then he seemed to think we were absolutely safe. I must go at once now to dear Annie and thank her." "I wish you would, Belle. She was very sad last night, poor child." "But, my dear, I never knew there were valuables in the box. You only spoke of coins." "Coins of the realm," said Belle with a laugh. "Very nearly £100. Money I have saved from my college expenses for a noble purpose. Don't question me now, mother. I will tell you by and by." Belle put on her dressing-gown and ran across the landing to Annie's door. She knocked. There was no answer. She turned the handle and entered. Annie's bed was empty. Annie herself had disappeared. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Girls of St. Wode's. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Girls of St. Wode's by L.T. Meade. Chapter 33. Confession. Yes, Annie Colchester had made up her mind. There was only one thing to be done. She must see Mr. Parker without a moment's delay, make full confession, and fling herself upon his mercy. Even prison would be better than this present agony, thought the poor girl. Whatever happens, I cannot face the Achesons again without their knowing the truth. With the first dawn she rose and dressed, and then wrote a little note to Mrs. Acheson. "You will think badly of me, and no wonder," wrote Annie. "The man who tried to steal the wooden box last night was my brother Rupert. Yes, he was my brother. He cut the square of glass out of the window and entered your house as a common burglar. Pray, don't do anything until you hear from me again. I am going to Mr. Parker." Belle found this note, read its contents, flushed slowly over it, rubbed her forehead in a distracted way, and then, hiding the note in the pocket of her dressing gown, returned to her own room. "Poor Annie has gone out of her mind," she said to herself. "Mr. Colchester, that charming, scholarly, delightful man, enter the house in order to take my box of money? Impossible! I should not believe it if 1,000 Annie Colchesters swore to it. This note is my property, and I refuse to divulge its contents for the present." Meanwhile Annie wandered about the streets until it was time for Mr. Parker to appear at his office. He had been called unexpectedly out of town on the previous day, or events would have come to an issue before now. On his arrival this morning he looked eagerly through his correspondence, and had just taken up the letter from the expert, and was reading its contents when his clerk entered, said that Miss Colchester had called, that she looked in serious trouble, and wished to see Mr. Parker without delay. "Ask Miss Colchester into my waiting room, and say I will send for her presently," was the reply. The clerk withdrew. Mr. Parker continued to read the expert's letter. "I thought so," he said to himself. "He says the writings are not identical, that they have not been written by the same person. Miss Annie little knows what a trap she has got into. She is just here in the nick of time. Yes, I will see her. I will get the whole naked truth out of her. Guilty? Of course she is guilty. After she has made her confession, she shall come with me to the Gilroys. What an old blind fool I have been! How could I ever doubt a girl with a face like Leslie's?" He stood up as he spoke. The expert's letter had pleased him, but he could not but own that he felt nearly as puzzled as ever. "Bless me if I know what it means even now," he said anxiously to himself. The puzzled man was standing on his hearth. His hair was wildly rubbed over his head, and his eyes looked fiercer than Annie had ever seen them when she entered the room. "Well, Miss Colchester," he said, "may I ask what is the meaning of this visit? It so happens that I am anxious to see you, and should have called upon you if you had not come to me. But as a rule I do not see people on private business in my office." "I have come to speak to you about Leslie Gilroy," said Annie. "You are fond of Leslie?" "It does not matter to you whether I care for her or not. What have you got to say about her?" "Only that she is quite innocent," said Annie. "She never wrote that letter." Mr. Parker's face wore an ugly sneer. "I wonder now," he said, coming a step or two forward, "if you have been following me about on the sly for the last day or two. Do you happen to know that I had taken that letter, and also the writing Leslie Gilroy left here the other day, to Essex the expert? You are sharp enough to know most things. Did you find out about that?" "I don't know what you mean." "My meaning is plain enough. It is better to make confession before open detection, is it not?" "I don't know anything," continued Annie. "I have never heard of Mr. Essex before. I am the most wretched, miserable girl in the world. I came to you to confess, not knowing that you were able to expose me. It does not matter now in the very least whether you expose me or not, for I am going to expose myself. I did write the letter. I knew at the time that it was forgery, but I was desperate. Rupert wanted £60. He said that if he did not get the money he would be locked up. The police were already after him. He owed the money for a debt of such a nature that if he did not pay it he would be locked up." "Well, all this is coming to the point with a vengeance," said Mr. Parker. Annie clutched hold of the nearest chair to steady herself. "I am miserable, and I know that I deserve imprisonment, or anything you like to give me," she said. "We will leave out the question about your deservings for the present," said the merchant. "What I want is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." "Well, I did it," said Annie. "I did commit forgery. I was nearly mad. I have always loved Rupert better than I thought. He was my only brother, and I could never turn from him. It was idolatry, and I am punished." "Go on with your story," said Mr. Parker. "I am doing so, only you must give me time. Rupert wanted the money, and I was distracted. Leslie and I were room fellows. She was always good to me. A nice return you have made for her kindness." "I know that well, but you cannot understand the temptation. There, I don't mean to excuse myself. On the very evening when I saw Rupert and found out all about his trouble, Leslie talked about you. I was so startled to find that she also knew you. She told me what you were doing for her, how liberal you were with your money, how very kind. She said that her father had been your greatest friend, and that you had made a sort of promise to help his children." As she spoke, a desperate idea came into my head. I was always very clever at imitating handwriting, and there was plenty of Leslie's about. The idea of making her appear to write to you for money came into my brain, and would not go away again. I thought of it all night, and the scheme seemed almost impossible to be detected, and was my last and only resource. I rose very early, got hold of some of Leslie's handwriting, copied it carefully, wrote the letter, which I brought to you, got permission to go to London from Miss Lauderdale, and saw you that afternoon. You gave me the money, I took it back, I gave it to Rupert. But even now I do not understand, said Mr. Parker. I came down to Wingfield the next day. I was very much disturbed, I can tell you. That letter, which seemed to be Leslie's, shook my faith. I always considered her the finest, sweetest girl I had ever come across, very like one whom I have lost. But no matter, you are unworthy to hear that name. I came to Wingfield, and I saw Leslie, and she knew all about it. She did not deny anything. That is because she was noble. I was obliged to tell her the truth, and she resolved to screen me and take the consequences. "'Pon my word, I never heard anything like this in the whole course of my life," said Mr. Parker. "Noble, I should think she was. But what were you made of? You allowed her. Think what she suffered. I distrusted her, and you allowed her to screen you." "I did, for Rupert's sake. I know I was bad, but I was not wholly bad. She knew that if it were discovered I should be expelled from St. Wode's, and my chance in life would be over, so she agreed to screen me. I didn't guess at the time how much she would suffer, and what it would mean to her. Leslie saw Rupert, and told him that if he would leave the country and never return, she would keep his secret and mine. Rupert promised to go away. He went, and I thought I should never see him again. Then I lost my interest in my work. I found I could not study, and when I passed my exam I only took an ordinary, and my prospects were more or less ruined. I was terribly poor, for the little money that I had saved I had already given to my brother. When my own money was nearly gone, I went to Leslie. That was a few days ago. I heard that you wanted a secretary, and I begged and implored of her to ask you to give me the post. Leslie did not like asking you. She said you were terribly changed to her, but at last she consented. She came here with me. You told her that if she told the real truth about the money, you would give me the post. How could she tell you the truth without ruining me? We both knew it was all up then, although she implored me at the 11th hour to make confession, but I could not. How could I without ruining Rupert? Your conscience has become very tender since then, said Mr. Parker. How is it you are here this morning? I will tell you. Because Rupert himself has opened my eyes. Oh, I love him still. Yes, I love him still, but my heart is broken. I don't care what happens to me. Friends of mine of the name of Acheson asked me to stay with them for a week. I had only 14 shillings in the world, and I thought I would go. Mrs. Acheson was very kind. She was like a mother to me. But on the very day I went, on the day I saw you last, I met my brother. He had never gone away. He had broken his word to Leslie. He had got into fresh, awful trouble. He wanted more and more money. And oh, Mr. Parker, last night he broke into the very house where I was staying, in order to steal some money which was in the drawing-room. What am I to do? Oh, if I might only die." The miserable girl fell on her knees, burying her face in a chair near by. Her faint sobs sounded through the room. Mr. Parker stood still for a moment. The colour in his face was coming and going. What was he to do? He hated Annie Colchester, and yet from the bottom of his soul he pitied her. Before he could decide anything, there came a knock at the door. "Particularly engaged just now," he called out. "It's Miss Gilroy, sir. She wants to see you as soon as possible." "Miss Gilroy? Bless my soul! What can she have come about? Oh, do let her in. I know she will plead for me. She will ask you not to be too bitterly hard," said poor Annie. Mr. Parker opened the door. "Come right in, Leslie," he said. His manner had changed. There was a tremble in his deep voice. Leslie came eagerly forward. "I have come to ask you if you know anything about Annie Colchester," she began. "We are in dreadful trouble about her. She has disappeared, and—" "Why, what is it? You seem to know something. What is wrong?" "Only that I have learned the truth at last, Leslie. Annie Colchester is here. She has confessed everything. Stand up, Annie, and speak this moment." But Annie was past this. Her head was buried in her hands, and sobs shook her frame. Leslie gave one glance from Mr. Parker to Annie, and then sprang forward. She fell on her knees by Annie's side and put her arms round her. "Oh, poor, poor Annie, have you really confessed?" said Leslie. "It was brave of you, dear, it was brave." She put her arms round Annie's neck and began to kiss her. "Oh, you don't know how she has been tried and tempted," she continued, turning to the merchant. "You cannot be angry with her any longer. Even the worst sinner ought to be forgiven when he confesses, and Annie is sorry, so sorry." Leslie's kisses fell on Annie's hot cheeks like rain. After a time Annie slightly moved her position and stole one arm softly round Leslie's neck. Mr. Parker looked at the two. "Bless my soul, this will upset me," he muttered to himself. "Never met a girl like Leslie. It makes one believe in Christianity, that it does." He suddenly left the room. An hour later he came back. Annie was now quite collected and calm. She had told Leslie everything. Leslie went straight up to Mr. Parker and took his hand. "You have got to do something for me," she said. "I'll do anything for you, Leslie. I feel fit to die when I think how I mistrusted you." "You had good reason to mistrust me, and I am not the least surprised. You need not reproach yourself in the very least. Now, if you will do something, if you will grant me a great, great favour, I shall be the happiest of girls. I shall gladly rejoice in the thought of my past suffering, if it can help Annie now." "You want a favour for her?" "I do, and I know you will grant it. It would be difficult for me to refuse you anything, but what is it? I want you to do this. I don't wish Rupert Colchester, bad as he is, to be locked up. I want him to leave the country. I want you to see that he goes. He must be seen off, for Annie is not to be persecuted by him any longer. When he is away, I want Annie to become your secretary. I will be responsible for her conduct, for her probity and honesty. She shall come and live at my mother's, and she shall work for you. Annie must be saved. Oh, I love her, Mr. Parker, I love her. Notwithstanding her sin, she was terribly tempted. You and I do not know anything of such temptation, but now we will save her, won't we? Will you do this for my sake? I declare I'd do anything in the world for you, but it's rather a big order. I shan't mind helping the poor girl, but the brother, is he to go off scot-free? For Annie's sake, yes. It would hurt her too terribly if he were punished. Give him one last chance, Mr. Parker. He may be saved even at the 11th hour. Oh, you are the best man I know. Prove it now. And this would make you quite happy, my dear. It would make me so happy I should scarcely know how to contain myself. Oh, say yes, here and now." "Then here is my hand on it. I say it here and now." Mr. Parker was as good as his word. He was not a man to do things by half measures, and he did not lose an hour in taking means to discover Rupert Colchester's whereabouts. He found that young man hiding from the police, gave him such a talking to that even he felt a little ashamed, and finally securing a berth for him on board a vessel which was bound for Australia, saw him off himself on the following day. The curtain drops forever on Rupert as far as this story is concerned. Annie is happy at last, notwithstanding her great trials. She is very busy, and has little time to think. She makes an excellent secretary, is painstaking, persevering, clever, and affectionate. Mr. Parker does not like to own it, but he is really getting very fond of her, and asks her advice on several matters in the most unwarrantable and unbusinesslike manner. Annie lives with Mrs. Gilroy, who is as kind can be to the motherless girl. As to the other girls, whose opening lives have been so briefly sketched in these pages, they are some of them still undergraduates at St. Wode's, and some are starting in the real battle of life, but they are all without exception doing well. Letty has given up her collegiate training, has entered society, making Mrs. Chetwynd very happy by doing so, and is much liked for her cheerful and taking manners and her pretty face. Eileen has quite recovered her health and strength. She and Marjorie are still at St. Wode's, and Marjorie never forgets that time when God answered her prayer and spared Eileen's life. Leslie is more beautiful and more beloved than ever by all those who know her. Mr. Parker openly talks of her as his adopted daughter, and her love for the old man is the sunshine of his declining years. Belle hopes to open her hostel within a year at the latest. There is a change for the better in Belle, and she is less arrogant than formerly, although she still firmly believes that the true aim of a woman's life is to delve in the rich soil of past literature and not to trouble herself much about the future. One and all, in their different ways, are going forward to a goal. Each has an ideal which will never be quite realised on earth, but each with strength and courage has learned to take her part bravely in life's battle. To each has been accorded a strength higher than her own, which enables her to refuse the evil and choose the good. End of chapter 33. End of The Girls of St. Wode's by L. T. Meade.